Section 6 of the Golden Bough, Part 4, Adonis, Attis, Osiris, Volume 2, by Sir James George Frazer. Chapter 5, The Nature of Osiris. Part 1, Osiris, a Corn God. Osiris, in one of his aspects, a personification of the corn. The foregoing survey of the myth and ritual of Osiris may suffice to prove that in one of his aspects the god was a personification of the corn, which may be said to die and come to life again every year. Through all the pomp and glamour with which in latter times the priests had invested his worship, the conception of him as the corn god comes clearly out in the festival of his death and resurrection, which was celebrated in the month of Koyak and at a later period in the month of Attis. That festival appears to have been essentially a festival of sowing, which probably fell at the time when the husbandman actually committed the seed to the earth. On that occasion, an effigy of the corn god, moulder of earth and corn, was buried with funeral rites in the ground in order that, dying there, he might come to life again with the new crops. The ceremony was, in fact, a charm to ensure the growth of the corn by sympathetic magic, and we may conjecture that as such it was practiced in a simple form by every Egyptian farmer on his fields long before it was adopted and transfigured by the priests in the stately ritual of the temple. In the modern, but doubtless ancient Arab custom of burying the old man, namely a sheaf of wheat, in the harvest field, and praying that he may return from the dead, we see the germ out of which the worship of the corn god Osiris was probably developed. Osiris, a child of sky and earth. The details of his myth fit in well with this interpretation of the god. He was said to be the offspring of sky and earth. What more appropriate parentage could be invented for the corn which springs from the ground that has been fertilized by the water of heaven? It is true that the land of Egypt owed its fertility directly to the Nile and not to showers, but the inhabitants must have known or guessed that the great river in its turn was fed by the rains which fell in the far interior. Again, the legend that Osiris was the first to teach man the use of corn would be most naturally told of the corn god himself. The legend of the dismemberment of Osiris points to the dismemberment of human beings, perhaps of the kings, in the character of the corn spirit. Further, the story that his mangled remains were scattered up and down the land and buried at different places may be a mythical way of expressing either the sowing or the winnowing of the grain. This latter interpretation is supported by the tale that Isis placed the severed limbs of Osiris on a corn sieve, or more probably the legend may be a reminiscence of a custom of slaying a human victim. Perhaps a representative of the corn spirit, and distributing his flesh or scattering his ashes over the fields to fertilize them. In modern Europe, the figure of death is sometimes torn in pieces, and the fragments are then buried in the ground to make the crops grow well. And in other parts of the world, human victims are treated in the same way. With regard to the ancient Egyptians, we have it on the authority of Manetho that they used to burn red-haired men and scatter their ashes with winnowing fans, as it is highly significant that the barbarous sacrifice was offered by the kings at the grave of Osiris. We may conjecture that the victims represent Osiris himself, who was annually slain, dismembered, and buried in their persons, that he might quicken the seed in the earth. Roman and Greek traditions of the dismemberment of kings. Possibly in prehistoric times, the kings themselves played the part of the god and were slain and dismembered in that character. Set as well as Osiris is said to have been torn in pieces after a reign of 18 days, which was commemorated by an annual festival of the same length. According to one story, Romulus, the first two kings of Rome, was cut in pieces by the senators who buried the fragments of him in the ground, and the traditional day of his death, the 7th of July, was celebrated with certain curious rites which were apparently connected with the artificial fertilization of the fig. Again, Greek legend told how Pentheus, king of Thebes, and Lycurgus, king of the Thracian Edonians, opposed the vine god Dionysus, and how the impious monarchs were rent in pieces, the one by the frenzied bacchanals, the other by horses. These Greek traditions may well be distorted reminiscence of a custom of sacrificing human beings, and especially divine kings, in the character of Dionysus, a god who resembled Osiris in many points and was said like him to have been torn limb from limb. We are told that in Chios, men were rent in pieces as a sacrifice to Dionysus, and since they died the same death as their god, it is reasonable to suppose that they personated him. The story of the Thracian Orpheus was similarly torn limb from limb by the bacchanals seems to indicate that he too perished in the character of the god whose death he died. It is significant that the Thracian Lycurgus, king of the Adonians, is said to have been put to death in order that the ground, which had ceased to be fruitful, might regain its fertility. Modern Thracia's pretense of killing a man who is sometimes called a king for the good of the crops. In some Thracian villages at carnival time, a custom is still annually observed, which may well be a mitigation of an ancient practice of putting a man, perhaps a king, to death in the character of Dionysus for the sake of the crops. A man disguised in goatskins and fawn skins, the livery of Dionysus, is shot at and falls down as dead. A pretense is made of flaying his body and of mourning over him, but afterwards he comes to life again. Further, a plough is dragged about the village and seed is scattered, while prayers are said that the wheat, rye and barley may be plentiful. One town, Frazer, where these customs are observed, was the capital of the old Thracian kings. In another town, Kosti, near the Black Sea, the principal master is called the king. He wears goatskins or sheepskins and is attended by a boy who dispenses wine to the people. The king himself carries seed, which he casts on the ground before the church, after being invited to throw it on two bands of married and unmarried men respectively. Finally, he is stripped of the skins and thrown into the river. Norwegian tradition of the dismemberment of a king, Halfdan the Black. Further, we read of a Norwegian king, Halfdan the Black, whose body was cut up and buried in different parts of his kingdom for the sake of ensuring the fruitfulness of the earth. He is said to have been drowned at the age of 40 through the breaking of the ice in spring. What followed his death is thus related by the Old Norse historian Snorri Sturluson. He had been the most prosperous, literally blessed with abundance, of all kings. So greatly did men value him that when the news came that he was dead and his body removed to Hringariki and intended for burial there, the chief men from Romariki and Westfold and Heathmork came and all requested that they might take his body with them and bury it in their various provinces. They thought that it would bring abundance to those who obtained it. Eventually it was settled that the body was distributed in 4 places. The head was laid in a barrow at Stein in Hringariki, and each party took away their own share and buried it. All the barrows are called Halfdan's barrows. It should be remembered that this Halfdan belonged to the family of the Ynglinks, who trace their descent from Frey, the great Scandinavian god of fertility. Frey, the Scandinavian god of fertility, buried at Uppsala. Frey himself is said to have reigned as king of Sweden in Uppsala. The years of his reign were plenteous, and the people laid the plenty to his account. So when he died, they would not burn him, as it had been customary to do with the dead before his time, but they resolved to preserve his body, believing that so long as it remained in Sweden, the land would have abundance and peace. Therefore they reared a great mound and put him in it, and sacrificed to him for plenty and peace ever afterwards. And for 3 years after his death they poured the tribute to him into the mound, as if he were alive. The gold they poured in one by one, the silver by a second, and the copper by a third. Segera, a magician of Kauai, is said to have been cut up after death and the pieces buried in gardens to fertilize them. The natives of Kauai, an island lying off the mouth of the Fly River in British New Guinea, tells of a certain magician named Segera, who had sago for his totem. When his son died, the death was set down to the magic of an enemy, and the bereaved father was so angry that by his spells he caused the whole crop of sago in the country to fail. Only in his own garden the sago grew as luxuriantly as ever. When many had died of famine, the people went to him and begged him to remove the spells which he had cast on the sago palms, so that they might eat food and live. The magician, touched with remorse and pity, went round planting a sago shoot in every garden, and the shoots flourished. Sago was plentiful once more, and the famine came to an end. When Segera was old and ill, he told the people that he would soon die, but that, nevertheless, he would cause their gardens to thrive. Accordingly, he instructed them that when he was dead, they should cut him up and place pieces of his flesh in their gardens, but his head was to be buried in his own garden. Of him it is said that he outlived the ordinary age, and that no man knew his father, and that he made the sago good, and no one was hungry anymore. Old men who were alive a few years ago affirmed that they had known Segera in their youth, and the general opinion of the Kiwai people seems to be that Segera died not more than 2 generations ago. Apparently widespread custom of dismembering a king or magician and burying the pieces in different parts of the kingdom. Taken all together, these legends point to a widespread practice of dismembering the body of a king or magician and burying the pieces in different parts of the country in order to ensure the fertility of the ground and probably also the fecundity of man and beast. Whether regarded as the descent of a god, as himself divine, or simply as a mighty enchanter, the king was believed to radiate magical virtue for the good of his subjects, quickening the seed in the earth and in the womb. This radiation of reproductive energy did not cease with his life. Hence the people deemed it essential to preserve his body as a pledge of the continued prosperity of the country. It would be natural to imagine that the spot where the dead king was buried would enjoy a more than ordinary share of his blessed influence, and accordingly disputes would almost inevitably arise between different districts for the exclusive possession of so powerful a talisman. These disputes could be settled and local jealousies appeased by dividing the precious body between the rival claimants, in order that all should benefit in equal measure by its life-giving properties. This was certainly done in Norway with the body of Halfdan the Black, the descendant of the harvest god Frey. It appears to be done with the body of Segera, the sago magician of Kiwai, and we may conjecture that in prehistoric times it was done with the bodies of Egyptian kings who personated Osiris, the god of fertility in general and of the corn in particular. At least such a practice would account for the legend of the mangling of the god's body and the distribution of the pieces throughout Egypt. In this dismemberment, a special virtue seems to have been ascribed to the genital organs. In this connection, the story that the genital member of Osiris was missing when Isis pierced together his mutilated body may not be without significance. When a Zulu medicine man wishes to make the crops grow well, he would take the body of a man who has died in full vigor and cut minute portions of tissue from the foot, the leg, the arm, the face, and the nail of a single finger in order to compound a fertilizing medicine out of them. But the most important part of the medicine consists of the dead man's generative organs, which are removed entire. All these pieces of the corpse are fried with herbs on a slow fire, then ground to powder and sown over the fields. We have seen that similarly the Egyptians scattered the ashes of human victims by means of winnowing fans, and if my explanation of the practice is correct, it may well have been that they, like the Zulus, attributed a special power of reproduction to the genital organs, and therefore carefully exercised them from the body of the victim in order to impart their virtue to the fields. I have conjectured that a similar use was made of the severed portions of the priests of Attis. The Egyptian kings probably opposed the custom as succeeded in abolishing it. To an ancient Egyptian, with his firm belief in a personal immortality dependent upon the integrity of the body, the prospect of mutilation after death must have been very repugnant, and we may suppose that the kings offered a strenuous resistance to the custom and finally succeeded in abolishing it. They may have represented to the people that they would attain their object better by keeping the royal corpse intact than by frittering it away in small pieces. Their subjects apparently acquiesced in the argument, or at all events in the conclusion, yet the mountains of masonry beneath which the old Egyptian kings lay buried may have been intended to guard them from the superstitious devotion of their friends quite as much as from the hostile designs of their enemies, since both alike must have been under a strong temptation to violate the sanctity of the grave in order to possess themselves of bodies which were believed to be endowed with the magical virtue or the most tremendous potency. Precautions taken to preserve the bodies of kings from mutilation. In antiquity, the safety of the state was often believed to depend on the possession of a talisman, which sometimes consisted of the bones of a king or hero. Hence the graves of such persons were sometimes kept secret. The violation of royal tombs by a conqueror was not a mere insult. It was a deadly blow struck at the prosperity of the kingdom. Hence, Ashurbanipal carried off to Assyria the bones of the kings of Elam, believing that thus he gave their shades no repose and deprived them of food and drink. The Moabites burned the bones of the king of Edom into lime. Lysimachus is said to have opened the graves of the kings of Epirus and scattered the bones of the dead. Graves of kings and chiefs in Africa kept secret. With savage and barbarous tribes in like manner, it is not unusual to violate the sanctity of the tomb, either for the purpose of wreaking vengeance on the dead, or more commonly perhaps for the sake of gaining possession of the bones and converting them to magical uses. Hence the Mpogwe kings of the Gaboon region in West Africa are buried secretly lest their heads should fall into the hands of men of another tribe, who would make a powerful fetish out of the brains. Again in Togoland, West Africa, the kings of the Ho tribe are buried with great secrecy in the forest, and a false grave is made ostentatiously in the king's house. None but his personal retainers and his single daughter know where the king's real grave is. The intention of this secret burial is to prevent enemies from digging up the corpse and cutting off the head. The heads of important chiefs in the Calabar districts are usually cut off from the body on burial and kept secretly for fear of the head, and thereby the spirit of the dead chief should be stolen from the town. If it were stolen, it would be not only a great advantage to its new possessor, but a great danger to the chief's old town, because he would know all the peculiar juju relating to it. For each town had a peculiar one, kept exceedingly secret, in addition to the general jujus, and this secret one would then be in the hands of the new owners of the spirit. The graves of Basuto chiefs are kept secret lest certain more or less imaginary witches and wizards called Baloi, who haunt tombs, should get possession of the bones and work evil magic with them. In the Thonga tribe of South Africa, when a chief dies, he is buried secretly by night in a sacred wood, and few people know the place of the grave. With some clans of the tribe, it is customary to level the mound over the grave, so that no sign whatever remains to show where the body has been buried. This is said to be done lest enemies should exhume the corpse and cut off the ears, the diaphragm, and other parts in order to make powerful ward charms out of them. Burial place of chiefs in Fiji kept secret. By many tribes in Fiji, the burial place of their chief is kept a profound secret, lest those whom he injured during his lifetime should revenge themselves by digging up and insulting or even eating his body. In some places the dead chief is buried in his own house, and armed warriors of his mother's kin keep watch night and day over his grave. After a time his bones are taken up and carried by night to some faraway inaccessible cave in the mountains, whose position is known only to a few trustworthy men. Ladders are constructed to enable them to reach the cave, and are taken down when the bones have been deposited there. Many frightful stories are told in connection with this custom, and it is certain that not even decomposition itself avails to balk the last revenge of cannibals if they can find the grave. The very bones of the dead chief are not secure from the revenge of those whose friends he killed during his lifetime, or whom he otherwise so exasperated by the tyrannous exercise of his power as to fill their hearts with a deadly hate. In one instance, within my own knowledge, when the hiding place was discovered, their bones were taken away, scraped, and stewed down into a horrible hell broth. Graves of Melanesian magicians kept secret. When a Melanesian dies who enjoyed a reputation for magical powers in his lifetime, his friends will sometimes hold a sham burial and keep the real grave secret for fear that men might come and dig up the skull and bones to make charms with them. Upon the corn eggs of Alaska, the bodies of dead whalers were cut up and used as talismans. Beliefs and practices of this sort are by no means confined to agricultural peoples. Among the corny eggs of Alaska, in ancient times, the pursuit of the whale was accompanied by numerous superstitious observances kept at secret by the hunters. Lieutenant Davidoff states that the whalers preserved the bodies of brave or distinguished men in secluded caves, and before proceeding upon a whale hunt, would carry these dead bodies into a stream and then drink of the water thus tainted. One famous whaler of Kadiak, who desired to flatter Baranov, the first chief manager of the Russian colonies, said to him, "When you die, I shall try to steal your body," intending thus to express his great respect for Baranov. On this occasion of the death of a whaler, his fellows cut the body into pieces, each man taking one of them for the purpose of rubbing his spearheads therewith. These pieces were dried or otherwise preserved and were frequently taken into the canoes as talismans. Assimilation of human victims to the corn. To return to the human victims whose ashes the Egyptians scattered with winnowing fans, the red hair of these unfortunates was probably significant. If I am right, the custom of sacrificing such persons was not a mere way of wreaking a national spite on fair-haired foreigners, whom the black-haired Egyptians of old, like the black-haired Chinese of modern times, may have regarded as red-haired devils. For in Egypt the oxen which were sacrificed had also to be red. A single black or white hair found on the beast would have disqualified it for the sacrifice. If, as I conjecture, these human sacrifices were intended to promote the growth of the crops, and the winnowing of their ashes seems to support this view, red-haired victims were perhaps selected as best fitted to personate the spirit of the ruddy grain. For when a god is represented by a living person, it is natural that the human representative should be chosen on the ground of his supposed resemblance to the divine original. Hence the ancient Mexicans, conceiving the maize as a personal being who went through the whole course of life between seed time and harvest, sacrificed newborn babes when the maize was sown, older children when it had sprouted, and so on till it was fully ripe, when they sacrificed old men. A name for Osiris was the crop or harvest, and the ancients sometimes explained him as a personification of the corn. Part 2. Osiris, a tree spirit. Osiris as a tree spirit. But Osiris was more than a spirit of the corn. He was also a tree spirit, and this may perhaps have been his primitive character, since the worship of trees is naturally older in the history of religion than the worship of the cereals. However that may have been, to an agricultural people like the Egyptians, who depended almost wholly on their crops, the corn god was naturally a far more important personage than the tree god, and attracted a larger share of their devotion. The character of Osiris as a tree spirit was represented very graphically in a ceremony described by Fraizer Maternus. His image enclosed in a pine tree. A pine tree having been cut down, the centre was hollowed out, and with the wood thus excavated, an image of Osiris was made, which was then buried like a corpse in the hollow of the tree. It is hard to imagine how the conception of a tree, as tenanted by a personal being, could be more plainly expressed. The image of Osiris thus made was kept for a year and then buried, exactly as was done with the image of Attis, which was attached to the pine tree. The ceremony of cutting the tree, as described by Fraizer Maternus, appears to be alluded to by Plutarch. It was probably the ritual counterpart of the mythical discovery of the body of Osiris enclosed in the Erica tree. The setting up of the dead pillar at the great festival of Osiris in the month of Koyak. Now we know from the monuments that at Busiris, Memphis and elsewhere, the great festival of Osiris closed on the 13th of Koyak with the setting up of a remarkable pillar known as the Tatu Tat Tet Dad or Dead. This was a column with 4 or 5 crossbars like superposed capitals at the top. The whole roughly resembled a telegraph post with the cross pieces which support the wires. Sometimes on the monuments a human form is given to the pillar by carving a grotesque face on it, robing the lower part, crowning the top with the symbols of Osiris and adding 2 arms which hold 2 other characteristic emblems of the god, the crook and the scourge or flail. On a Theban tomb, the king himself, assisted by his relations and a priest, is represented hauling at the ropes by which the pillar is being raised, while the queen looks on and her 16 daughters accompany the ceremony with the music of rattles and sistrums. Again, in the hall of the Assyrian mysteries at Abydos, the king Seti I and the goddess Isis are depicted raising the column between them. In Egyptian theology, the pillar was interpreted as a backbone of Osiris, and whatever its meaning may have been, it was one of the holiest symbols of the natural religion. It might very well be a conventional way of representing a tree stripped of its leaves, and if Osiris was a tree spirit, the bare trunk and branches might naturally be described as his backbone. The setting up of the pillar may have been an emblem of the god's resurrection. The setting up of the column would thus, as several modern scholars believe, shadow forth the resurrection of the god, and the importance of the occasion would explain and justify the prominent part which the king appears to have taken in the ceremony. It is to be noted that in the myth of Osiris, the Erica tree, which shot up and enclosed his dead body, was cut down by a king and turned by him into a pillar of his house. We can hardly doubt, therefore, that this incident of the legend was supposed to be dramatically set forth in the erection of the dead column by the king. Like the similar custom of cutting a pine tree and fastening an image to it in the rites of Attis, the ceremony may have belonged to that class of customs of which the bringing in of the maypole is among the most familiar. The association of the king and queen of Egypt with the dead pillar reminds us of the association of the king and queen of May with the maypole. The resemblance may be more than superficial. Osiris associated with the pine, the sycamore, the tamarisk, and the acacia. In the hall of Osiris at Dendera, the coffin containing the hawk-headed mummy of the god is clearly depicted as enclosed within a tree, apparently a conifer, the trunk and branches of which are seen above and below the coffin. The scene thus corresponds closely both to the myth and to the ceremony described by Firmicus Maternus. In another scene at Dendera, a tree of the same sort is represented growing between the dead and the reviving Osiris, as if on purpose to indicate that the tree was the symbol of the divine resurrection. A pine cone often appears on the monuments as an offering presented to Osiris, and a manuscript of the Louvre speaks of the cedar as sprung from him. The sycamore and its tamarisk were also his trees. In inscriptions he is spoken of as residing in them, and in tombs his mother, Nut, is often portrayed standing in the midst of a sycamore tree and pouring a libation for the benefit of the dead. In one of the pyramid texts we read, "Hail to thee, sycamore, which enclosed the god." And in certain temples the statue of Osiris used to be placed for 7 days upon branches of sycamores. The explanation appended in the sacred text declares that the placing of the image on the tree was intended to record the 7 months passed by Osiris in the womb of his mother Nut, the goddess of the sycamore. The rite records a story that Adonis was born after 10 months gestation from a myrrh tree. Further, in a sepulchre at Hau, Diospolis Parva, a tamarisk is depicted overshadowing the tomb of Osiris, while a bird is perched among the branches with the significant legend, "The Soul of Osiris." showing that the spirit of the dead god was believed to haunt his sacred tree. Again, in the series of sculptures which illustrate the mystic history of Osiris in the great temple of Isis at Philae, a tamarisk is figured with two men pouring water on it. The accompanying inscription leaves no doubt, says Bough, that the verdure of the earth was believed to be connected with the verdure of the trees, and that the sculpture refers to the grave of Osiris at Philae, of which Plutarch tells us that it was overshadowed by a mythide plant taller than any olive tree. This sculpture, it may be observed, occurs in the same chamber in which the god is represented as a corpse with ears of corn springing from him. In inscriptions he is referred to as the one in the tree, the solitary one in the acacia, and so forth. On their monuments he sometimes appears as a mummy covered with a tree or with plants. The trees are represented growing from his grave. Osiris in relation to fruit trees, wells, the vine, and ivy. It accords with the character of Osiris as a tree spirit that his worshippers were forbidden to injure fruit trees, and with his character as a god of vegetation in general, that they were not allowed to stop up wells of water, which are so important for the irrigation of hot southern lands. According to one legend, he taught men to train the vine to poles, to prune its superfluous foliage, and to extract the juice of the grape. In the papyrus of Nebseni, written about 1550 BC, Osiris is depicted sitting in a shrine, from the roof of which hang clusters of grapes, and the papyrus of the royal scribe Necht, we see the god enthroned in front of a pool, from the banks of which a luxuriant vine, with many branches of grapes, rose towards the green face of the sated deity. The ivy was sacred to him, and was called his plant because it is always green. Part 3. Osiris, a god of fertility. Osiris perhaps conceived as a god of fertility in general. As a god of vegetation, Osiris was naturally conceived as a god of creative energy in general, since men at a certain stage of evolution failed to distinguish between the reproductive powers of animals and of plants. Hence, a striking feature in his worship was a coarse but expressive symbolism by which this aspect of his nature was presented to the eye, not merely of the initiated, but of the multitude. At his festival, women used to go about the villages singing songs in his praise and carrying obscene images of him which they set in motion by means of strings. The custom was probably a charm to ensure the growth of the crops. A similar image of him, decked with all the fruits of the earth, is said to have stood in a temple before a figure of Isis. In the chambers dedicated to him at Philae, the dead god is portrayed lying on his bier in an attitude which indicates in the plainest way that even in death his generative virtue was not extinct but only suspended, ready to prove a source of life and fertility to the world when the opportunity should offer. Hymns addressed to Osiris contain allusions to this important side of his nature. In one of them it is said that the world waxes green and triumph through him, and another declares, "Thou art the father and mother of mankind. They live on thy breath, they subsist on the flesh of thy body." We may conjecture that in this paternal aspect he was supposed, like other gods of fertility, to bless men and women with offspring, and that the processions at his festival were intended to promote the object as well as to quicken the seed in the ground. It would be to misjudge ancient religion to denounce as lewd and profligate the emblems and the ceremonies which the Egyptians employed for the purpose of giving effect to this conception of the divine power. The ends which they proposed to themselves in these rites were natural and laudable. Only the means they adopted to compass them were mistaken. A similar fallacy induced the Greeks to adopt a like symbolism in their Dionysic festivals, and the superficial but striking resemblance to them produced between the two religions has perhaps more than anything else misled inquirers, both ancient and modern, into identifying worships which, though certainly akin in nature, are perfectly distinct and independent in origin. Part 4. Osiris, a god of the dead. As god of the corn, Osiris came to be viewed as the god of the resurrection. We have seen that in one of his aspects Osiris was a ruler and judge of the dead. To a people like the Egyptians, who not only believed in a life beyond the grave, but actually spent much of their time, labour and money preparing for it, this office of the god must have appeared hardly, if at all, less important than his function of making the earth to bring forth its fruits in due season. We may assume that in the faith of his worshippers, the two provinces of the god were intimately connected. In laying the dead in the grave, they committed them to his keeping who could raise them from the dust to life eternal, even as he caused the seed to spring from the ground. Of that faith, the corn-stuffed effigies of Osiris found in Egyptian tombs furnish an eloquent and unequivocal testimony. They were once an emblem of the instrumental resurrection. Thus, from the sprouting of the grain, the ancient Egyptians drew an augury of human immortality. They are not the only people who have built the same far-reaching hopes on the same slender foundation. Thou fool, that which thou sowest not that body that shall be, but bare grain. It may chance of wheat, or of some other grain. But God giveth it a body as it hath pleased him, and to every seed his own body. So also is the resurrection of the dead. It is sown in corruption, it is praised in incorruption. It is sown in weakness, it is raised in power. It is sown a natural body, it is raised a spiritual body. Great popularity of the worship of Osiris. A god who thus set his people with his own broken body in his life, and who held out to them the promise of a blissful eternity in a better world hereafter, naturally reigned supreme in their affections. We need not wonder, therefore, that in Egypt the worship of the other gods was overshadowed by that of Osiris, and while they were revered, each in his own district, he and his divine partner Isis were adorned in awe. End of section 6. Part 7 of The Golden Bough, A Study in Magic and Religion by Sir James George Frazer. Chapter 6, Isis. Multifarious attributes of Isis. The original meaning of the goddess Isis is still more difficult to determine than that of her brother and husband, Osiris. Her attributes and epithets were so numerous that in the hieroglyphics she is called the Many-Named, the Thousand-Named, and in Greek inscriptions, the Myriad-Named. The late eminent Dutch scholar C.P. T.L. confessed candidly that it is now impossible to tell precisely to what natural phenomena the character of Isis at first referred. Yet he adds, originally she was a goddess of fecundity. Similarly, Dr. Budge writes that Isis was the great and beneficent goddess and mother whose influence and love pervaded all heaven and earth and the abode of the dead, and she was a personification of the great famine, creative power which conceived and brought forth every living creature and thing, from the gods in heaven to man on the earth, and to the insect on the ground. What she brought forth she protected and cared for and fed and nourished, and she employed her life in using her power graciously and successively, not only in creating new beings, but in restoring those that were dead. She was, besides these things, the highest type of a faithful and loving wife and mother, and it was this capacity that the Egyptians honoured and worshipped her most. How Isis resembled yet differed from the mother goddess of Asia. Thus, in her character of a goddess of fecundity, Isis answered to the great mother goddesses of Asia, though she differed from them in the chastity and fidelity of her conjugal life. For while they were unmarried and dissolute, she had a husband and a true wife to him, as well as an affectionate mother to their son. Hence her beautiful Madonna-like figure reflects a more refined state of society and of morals than the coarse, sensual, cruel figures of Astarte and Attis, Cybele, and the rest of that crew. A clear trace, indeed, of an ethical standard, very different from our own, lingers in her double relation of sister and wife to Osiris. But in most other respects, she is rather late than primitive, the full-blown flower rather than the seed of a long religious development. The attributes ascribed to her were too various to be all her own. They were graces borrowed from many lesser deities, sweets rifled from 1,000 humbler plants to feed the honey of her superb efflorescences. Yet in her complex nature, it is perhaps still possible to detect the original nucleus, round by which a slow process of accretion and other elements gathered. Isis perhaps originally a goddess of the corn. For if her brother and husband Osiris was in one of his aspects the corn god, as we have seen reason to believe, she must surely have been the corn goddess. There are at least some grounds for thinking so, for if we may trust that Diodorus Siculus, whose authority appears to have been the Egyptian historian Manetho, the discovery of wheat and barley was attributed to Isis, and at her festivals stalks on the grains were carried in procession to commemorate the boon she had conferred to men. A further detail is added by Augustine. He says that Isis made the discovery of barley the moment when she was sacrificing to the common ancestors of her husband and herself, all of whom had been kings, and that she showed the newly discovered ears of barley to Osiris and his counselor Thoth, or Mercury as Roman writers called him. That is why, at Augustine, they identify Isis with Ceres. Further, at harvest time, when the Egyptian reapers had cut the first stalks, they laid them down and beat their breasts, wailing out calling upon Isis. The custom has been already explained as a lament for the corn spirit slain under the sickle. Amongst the epithets by which Isis is designated in the inscriptions are Creatress of green things, Green Goddess, whose green colour is likened to the greenness of the earth, Lady of Bread, Lady of Beer, Lady of Abundance. According to Bough, she is not only the creatress of the fresh verdure of vegetation which covers the earth, but is actually the green cornfield itself, which is personified as a goddess. This is confirmed by the epithet Sochit or Sochet, meaning a cornfield, a sense which the word still retains in Coptic. The Greeks conceived of Isis as a corn goddess, for they identified her with Demeter. In a Greek epigram, she is described as she who has given birth to the fruits of the earth and the mother of the ears of corn. And at hymn compassed in her honour she speaks of herself as queen of the wheat field and described as charged with the care of the fruitful furrow's wheat-rich path. Accordingly, Greek or Roman artists often represented her with ears of corn on her head or in her hand. Refinement and spiritualization of Isis in later times, the popularity of her worship in the Roman Empire. Such, we may suppose, was Isis in the olden time, a rustic corn mother, adorned with uncouth rites by Egyptian swains. But the homely features of the clownish goddess could hardly be traced in the refined, the saintly form, which, spiritualized by ages of religious evolution, she presented to her worshippers of after days as a true wife, the tender mother, and the beneficent queen of nature, encircled with the nimbus of moral purity, of immemorial and mysterious sanctity. Thus chastened and transfigured, she won many hearts far beyond the boundaries of her native land. In that welter of religions which accompanied the decline of national life in antiquity, her worship was one of the most popular at Rome and throughout the empire. Some of the Roman emperors themselves were openly addicted to it, and however the religion of Isis may, like many other, have been often worn as a cloak by men and women of loose life, her rites appear on the whole to have been honourably distinguished by a dignity and composure, a solemnity and decorum well fitted to soothe the troubled mind, to ease the burdened heart. They appealed therefore to gentle spirits, and above all to women, whom the bloody and licentious rites of other oriental goddesses only shocked and repelled. We need not wonder then, that in a period of decadence, when traditional faiths were shaken, when systems clashed, when men's minds were distinguished, when the fabric of empire itself, once deemed eternal, began to show ominous rents and fissures, the serene figure of Isis with her spiritual calm, her gracious promise of immortality, should have appeared to many like a star in a stormy sky, and should have roused in their breasts a rapture of devotion not unlike that which was paid in the Middle Ages to the Virgin Mary. Resemblance of Isis to the Madonna. Indeed, her stately ritual, with its shaven and tonsured priests, its matins and vespers, its tinkling music, its baptism and aspersions of holy water, its solemn procession, its jeweled images of the Mother of God, presented many points of similarity to the pomps and ceremonies of Catholicism. The resemblance need not be purely accidental. Ancient Egypt may have contributed its share to the gorgeous symbolism of the Catholic Church, as well as to the pale abstractions of her theology. Certainly in art, the figure of Isis suckling the infant Horus is so like that of the Madonna and Child that it has sometimes received the adoration of ignorant Christians, and to Isis in her latter character of patroness of mariners, the Virgin may perhaps owe the beautiful epithet of Stella Maris, Star of the Sea, under which she is adorned by tempest-tossed sailors. The attributes of a marine deity may have been bestowed on Isis by the seafaring Greeks of Alexandria. They are quite foreign to her original character and to the habits of the Egyptians, who had no love of the sea. On this hypothesis, Sirius, the bright star of Isis, which on July mornings rises from the glassy waves of the eastern Mediterranean, a harbinger of halcyon weather to mariners, was a true Stella Maris, the Star of the Sea. End of Section 7. Section 8 of The Golden Bough, A Study in Magic and Religion, Part 4, Adonis, Attis, Osiris, Volume 2, by Sir James George Frazer. Chapter 7, Osiris and the Sun. Osiris interpreted as the sun by many modern writers. Osiris has been sometimes interpreted as the sun god, and in modern times this view has been held by so many distinguished writers that it deserves a brief examination. If we inquire on what evidence Osiris has been identified with the sun or the sun god, it will be found on analysis to be minute in quantity and dubious whether it is not absolutely worthless in quality. The diligent Jablonski, the first modern scholar to collect and sift the testimony of classical writers on Egyptian religion, says that it can be shown in many ways that Osiris is the sun, and he could produce a cloud of witnesses to prove it. But that is needless to do so, since no learned man is ignorant of the fact. Of the writers whom he condescends to quote, the only two who expressly identify Osiris with the sun are Diodorus and Macrobius. The passage in Diodorus runs thus: It is said that the aboriginal inhabitants of Egypt, looking up to the sky, and smitten with awe and wonder at the nature of the universe, supposed that there were two gods, eternal and primeval, the sun and the moon, of whom they named the sun Osiris and the moon Isis. Even if Diodorus's authority for this statement is Manetho, as there is some ground for believing, little or no weight can be attached to it, for it is plainly a philosophical and therefore a late explanation of the first beginnings of Egyptian religion, reminding us of Kant's familiar saying about the starry heavens and the moral law, rather than of the rude traditions of a primitive people. Jablonski's second authority, Macrobius, is no better, but rather worse, for Macrobius was the father of that large family of mythologists who resolve all or most gods into the sun. According to him, Mercury was the sun, Mars was the sun, Janus was the sun, Saturn was the sun, and so was Jupiter, also Nemesis, likewise Pan, and so on through a great part of the pantheon. It was natural, therefore, that he should identify Osiris with the sun, but his reasons for doing so are exceedingly slight. He refers to the ceremonies of alternate lamentation and joy as if they reflect the vicissitudes of the great luminary in his course through the sky. Further, he argues that Osiris must be the sun because an eye was one of his symbols. It is true that an eye was a symbol of Osiris, and it is also true that the sun was often called the Eye of Horus. Yet the coincidence hardly suffices to establish the identity of the two deities. The opinion that Osiris was the sun is also mentioned, but not accepted by Plutarch, and is referred to by Firmicus Maternus. The latter identification of Osiris with Ra, the sun god, does not prove that Osiris was originally the sun. Amongst modern scholars, Lipsius, in identifying Osiris with the sun, appears to rely mainly on the passage of Diodorus already quoted. But the monuments, he adds, also show that down to a late time Osiris was sometimes conceived as Ra. In this quality he is named Osiris Ra, or even in the Book of the Dead, and Isis is often called the royal consort of Ra. That Ra was both the physical sun and the sun god is undisputed, but with every difference for the authority of so great a scholar as Lepsius, we may doubt whether the identification of Osiris with Ra can be accepted as proof that Osiris was originally the sun. Such identification sprang from attempts to unify and amalgamate the many local cults of Egypt. For the religion of ancient Egypt may be described as a confederacy of local cults, which, while maintaining against each other a certain measure of jealous and even hostile independence, were yet constantly subjected to the fusing and amalgamating influence of political centralization and philosophic thought. The history of the religion appears to have largely consisted of a struggle between these opposite forces or tendencies. On the one side, there was a conservative tendency to preserve the local cults with all their distinctive features, fresh, sharp, and crisp as they had been handed down from an immemorial past. On the other side, there was a progressive tendency favoured by the gradual fusion of the people under a powerful central government, first to dull the edge of these provincial distinctions and finally to break them down completely and merge them in a single national religion. The Conservative Party probably mustered in its ranks the great bulk of the people, their prejudices and affections being warmly enlisted in favour of the local deity with whose temple and rites they had been familiar from childhood, and the popular dislike of change, based on the endearing effect of old association, must have been strongly reinforced by the less disinterested opposition of the local clergy, whose material interests would necessarily suffer with any decay of their shrines. On the other hand, the kings whose power and glory rose with the political and ecclesiastical consolidation of the realm were the natural champions of religious unity, and their efforts would be seconded by the refined and thoughtful minority who could hardly fail to be shocked by the many barbarous and revolting elements in the local rites. As usually happens in such cases, the process of religious unification appears to have been largely effected by discovering points of similarity, real or imaginary, between the provincial deities, which were thereupon declared to be only different names or manifestations of the same god. Most Egyptian gods were at some time identified with the sun. Of the deities who thus acted as centres of attraction, absorbing in themselves a multitude of minor divinities, by far the most important was the sun god Ra. There appear to have been few gods in Egypt who were not, at one time or other, identified with him. Ammon of Thebes, Horus of the East, Horus of Edfu, Chnum of Elephantine, Tum of Heliopolis, all were regarded as one god, the sun. Even the water god Sobbed, in spite of his crocodile shape, did not escape the same fate. The attempt of Amenophilus IV to abolish all gods except the sun god. Indeed, one king, Amenophilus IV, undertook to sweep away all the old gods at a stroke and replace them by a single god, the great living disk of the sun. In the hymns composed in his honour, this deity is referred to as the living disk of the sun, besides whom there is none other. He is said to have made the far heaven, and men, beasts and birds. He strengthened the eyes with his beams, and when he showeth himself, all flowers live and grow. The meadows flourish at his upgoing and are drunken at his sight. The cattle skip on their feet, and the birds that are in the marsh flutter for joy. It is he who bringeth the years, createth the months, maketh the days, calculateth the hours, the Lord of time by whom men reckon. In his zeal for the unity of God, the king commanded to erase the names of all the gods from the monuments and to destroy their images. His rage was particularly directed against the god Ammon, whose name and likeness were effaced wherever they were found. Even the sanctity of the tomb was violated in order to destroy the memorials of the hated deity. In some of the halls of the great temples at Karnak, Luxor, and other places, all the names of the gods, with a few chance exceptions, were scratched out. The monarch even changed his own name, Amenophis, because it was compounded of Ammon, and took instead the name of Chuenaten. gleam of the sun's disk. Thebes itself, the ancient capital of his glorious ancestors, full of monuments of their piety and idolatry, was no longer a fit home for the Puritan king. He deserted it and built for himself a new capital in the Middle East at the place now known as Tel el-Amarna. Here in a few years, a city of palaces and gardens rose like an exhalation at his command, and near the king, his clearly loved wife and children, and his complacent courtiers led a merry life. The grave and sombre ritual of Thebes was discarded. The sun god was worshipped with songs and hymns, and the music of harps and flutes, with offerings of cakes and fruits and flowers. Blood seldom stained his kindly altars. The king himself celebrated the offices of religion. He preached with uncation, and we may be sure that his courtiers listened with at least an outward semblance of devotion. From the two faithful portraits of himself which he had bequeathed to us, we can still picture to ourselves the heretic king in the pulpit, with his tall, lanky figure, his bandy legs, his pot-belly, his long, lean, haggard face aglow with the fever of religious fanaticism. Yet the doctrine, as he loved to call it, which he proclaimed to his hearers, has apparently no stern message of renunciation in this world, of terrors in the world to come. The thoughts of death, of judgment, and of a life beyond the grave, which weighed like a nightmare on the minds of the Egyptians, seem to have been banished for a time. Even the name of Osiris, the awful judge of the dead, is not once mentioned in the graves at Tel el-Amarna. Failure of the attempt. All this lasted only during the life of the reformer. His death was followed by a violent reaction. The old gods are reinstated in their rank and privileges, their names and images were restored, and new temples were built. But all the shrines and palaces reared by the late king were thrown down. Even the sculptures that refer to him and to his god in rock tombs and on the sides of hills were erased or filled up with stucco. His name appears on no later monument and was carefully omitted from all official lists. The new capital was abandoned, never to be inhabited again. Its plan can still be traced in the sands of the desert. This attempt of King Amenophis IV is only an extreme example of a tendency which appears to have affected the religion of Egypt as far back as we can trace it. Identification with the sun is no evidence of the original character of an Egyptian god. Therefore, to come back to our point, in attempting to discover the original character of any Egyptian god, no weight can be given to the identification of him with other gods, least of all with the sun god Ra. Far from helping to follow up the trail, these identifications only cross and confuse it. The best evidence for the original character of the Egyptian gods is to be found in their ritual and myths, so far as these are known, and the manner in which they are portrayed on the monuments. It is mainly on evidence drawn from these sources that I rest my interpretation of Osiris. The solar theory of Osiris does not explain his death and resurrection. The ground upon which some modern writers seem chiefly to rely for their identification of Osiris with the sun is that the story of his death fits better with the solar phenomena than with any other in nature. It may readily be admitted that the daily appearance and disappearance of the sun might very naturally be expressed by a myth of his death and resurrection. The writers who regard Osiris as the sun are careful to indicate that it is the diurnal and not the annual course of the sun to which they understand the myth to apply. Thus Ranulf, who identified Osiris with the sun, admitted that the Egyptian sun could not, with any show of reason, be described as dead in winter. But if his daily death was the theme of the legend, why was it celebrated by an annual ceremony? This fact alone seems fatal to the interpretation of the myth as a script of a sunset and sunrise. Again, though the sun may be said to die daily, in what sense can it be said to be torn in pieces? The death and resurrection of Osiris are more naturally explained by the annual decay and growth of vegetation. In the course of our inquiry, it has, I trust, been made clear that there is another natural phenomenon to which the concept of death and resurrection is as applicable as a sunset and sunrise, and which, as a matter of fact, has been so conceived and represented in folk custom. That phenomenon is the annual growth and decay of vegetation. A strong reason for interpreting the death of Osiris as a decay of vegetation rather than as the sunset is to be found in the general, though not unanimous, voice of antiquity, which classed together the worship and myths of Osiris, Adonis, Attis, Dionysus, and Demeter as religions of essentially the same type. The consensus of ancient opinion on this subject seems too great to be rejected as a mere fancy. So closely did the rites of Osiris resemble those of Adonis at Byblus, that some of the people of Byblus themselves maintained that it was Osiris and not Adonis whose death was mourned by them. Such a view would certainly not have been held if the rituals of the two gods had not been so alike as to be almost indistinguishable. Herodotus found the similarity between the rites of Osiris and Dionysus so great that he thought it impossible the latter could have arisen independently. They must, he supposed, have been recently borrowed with slight alterations by the Greeks from the Egyptians. Again, Plutarch, a very keen student of comparative religion, insists upon the detailed resemblance of the rites of Osiris to those of Dionysus. We cannot reject the evidence of such intelligent and trustworthy witnesses on plain matters of fact which fell under their own cognizance. Their explanations of the worships it is indeed possible to reject, for the meaning of religious cults is often open to question, but resemblances of ritual are matters of observation. Therefore, those who explain Osiris as the sun are driven to the alternative of either dismissing as mistaken the testimony of antiquity to the similarity of the rites of Osiris, Adonis, Attis, Dionysus, and Demeter, or of interpreting all these rites as sun worship. No modern scholar has fairly faced and accepted either side of this alternative. To accept the former would be to affirm that we know the rites of these deities better than the men who practiced, or at least who witnessed them. To accept the latter would involve a wrenching, clipping, mangling, and distorting of myth and ritual from which even Macrobius shrank. On the other hand, the view that the essence of all these rites was the mimic death and revival of vegetation explains them separately and collectively in an easy and natural way, and harmonizes with the general testimony borne by the ancients to their substantial similarity. End of Section 8. Section 9 of the Golden Bough, a study of magic and religion, Part 4, Adonis, Attis, Osiris, Volume 2 by Sir James George Frazer, Chapter 8, Osiris and the Moon. Osiris was sometimes interpreted by the ancients as the moon. Before we conclude this study of Osiris, it will be worthwhile to consider an ancient view of this nature, which deserves more attention than it has received in modern times. We are told by Plutarch that among the philosophers who saw in the gods of Egypt personifications of natural objects and forces, there were some who interpreted Osiris as the moon and his enemy Typhon as the sun, because the moon, with her humid and generative light, is favourable to the propagation of animals and the growth of plants, while the sun with his fierce fire scorches and burns up all growing things, renders the greater part of the earth uninhabitable by reason of his blaze, and often overpowers the moon herself. Whatever may be thought of the physical qualities here attributed to the moon, the arguments adduced by the ancients to prove the identity of Osiris with their luminary carry with them a weight which has at least not been lightened by the results of modern research. An examination of them and of other evidence pointing in the same direction will, perhaps, help to set the original character of the Egyptian deity in a clearer light. Evidence of the association of Osiris with the moon. 1. Osiris was said to have lived to reign 28 years. This might fairly be taken as a mythical expression for a lunar month. 2. His body was reported to have been rent into 14 pieces. This might be interpreted of the waning moon, which appears to lose a portion of itself on each of the 14 days that make up the second half of the lunar month. It is expressly said that his enemy Typhon found the body of Osiris at the full moon. Thus the dismemberment of the god would begin with the waning of the moon. To primitive man it seems manifest that the waning moon is actually dwindling, and he naturally enough explains its diminution by supposing that the planet is being rent or broken in pieces or eaten away. The Klamath Indians of Oregon speak of the moon as the one broken to pieces, with reference to its changing aspect. They never apply such a term to the sun, whose apparent change of bulk at different seasons of the year is far too insignificant to attract the attention of the savage, or at least to be described by him in such forcible language. The Dakotas believe that when the moon is full, a great many little mice begin to nibble at one side of it and do not cease till they have eaten it all up, after which a new moon is born and grows to maturity, only to share the fate of its countless predecessors. A similar belief is held by the Hanzuls of the Carpathians, except that they ascribe the destruction of the old moon to wolves instead of to mice. 3. At the new moon of the month Faminoth, which was beginning of spring, the Egyptians celebrated what they called the entry of Osiris into the moon. 4. At the ceremony called the burial of Osiris, the Egyptians made a crescent-shaped chest because the moon, when it approaches the sun, assumes the form of a crescent and vanishes. 5. The bull Attis, held to be an image of the soul of Osiris, was born of a cow which was believed to have been impregnated, not in the vulgar way by a bull, but by a divine influence emanating from the moon. 6. Once a year, at the full moon, pigs were sacrificed simultaneously to the moon and Osiris. 7. In a hymn supposed to be addressed by Isis to Osiris, it is said that Thoth placeth thy soul in the Barak Ma'at in that name which is thine of God Moon. And again, thou who comest to us as a child each month, we do not cease to contemplate thee. Thine emanation heightens the brilliancy of the stars of Orion in the firmament. Here then Osiris is identified with the moon in set terms. Even the same hymn is said to illuminate us like Ra, the sun. That is obviously no reason for identifying him with the sun, but quite the contrary. For the moon may reasonably be compared to the sun, neither the sun nor anything else can reasonably be compared to itself. 8. In art, Osiris is sometimes represented as a human-headed mummy grasping in his hands his characteristic emblems and wearing on his head, instead of the usual crown, a full moon with a crescent. The identification of Osiris with the moon appears to be based on the comparatively late theory that all things grow and decay with the waxing and waning of the moon. Now, if in one of his aspects Osiris was originally a deity of vegetation, we can easily enough understand why in a later and more philosophic age he should come to be thus identified or confounded with the moon. For as soon as he begins to meditate upon the causes of things, the early philosopher is led by certain obvious though fallacious appearances to regard the moon as the ultimate cause of the growth of plants. In the first place, he associates its apparent growth and decay with the growth and decay of sublunary things, and imagines that in virtue of a sacred sympathy, the celestial phenomena really produce those terrestrial changes, which, in point of fact, they merely resemble. Thus Pliny says that the moon may fairly be considered the planet of breath, because it saturates the earth, and by its approach fills bodies, while by its departure it empties them. Hence it is, he goes on, that shellfish increase with the increase of the moon, and that bloodless creatures essentially feel breath at that time. Even the blood of men grows and diminishes with the light of the moon, and leaves and herbage also feel the same influence, since the lunar energies penetrate all things. There is no doubt, writes Macrobius, that the moon is the author and framer of mortal bodies, so much so that some things expand or shrink as it waxes or wanes. Again, Aulus Gellius puts in the mouth of a friend the remark that the same things which grow with the waxing do dwindle with the waning moon, and he quotes from a commentary of Plutarch's on Hesiod a statement that the onion is the only vegetable which violates this great law of nature by sprouting in the wane and withering in the increase of the moon. Scottish Highlanders allege that in the increase of the moon everything has a tendency to grow or stick together, and they call the second moon of autumn the ripening moon, Gaelic and Abacanid, because they imagine the crops ripen as much by its light as by day. Practical rules founded on this lunar theory. From this supposed influence of the moon on the life of plants and animals, men in ancient and modern times have deduced a whole code of rules for the guidance of the husbandman, the shepherd, and others in the conduct of their affairs. Thus, an ancient writer on agriculture lays it down as a maxim that whatever is to be sown should be sown while the moon is waxing, and that whatever is to be cut or gathered should be cut or gathered while it is waning. A modern treatise on superstition describes how the superstitious man regulates all his conduct by the moon. Whatever he would have to grow, he sets about it when she is in her increase, but for what he would have made less, he chooses her wane. In Germany, the phases of the moon are observed by superstitious people at all the more or even less important actions of life, such as tilling the fields, building or changing houses, marriages, haircutting, bleeding, cupping, and so forth. The particular rules vary in different places, but the principle generally followed is that whatever is done to increase anything should be done while the moon is waxing. Whatever is done to diminish anything should be done while the moon is waning. Supposed influence of the phases of the moon on the operations of husbandry. For example, sowing, planting, and grafting should be done in the first half of the moon, but the felling of timber and mowing should be done in the second half. In various parts of Europe, it is believed that plants, nails, hair, and corns cut while the moon is on the increase will grow again fast, but that if cut while it is on the decrease, they will grow slowly or waste away. Hence, persons who wish their hair to grow thick and long should cut it in the first half of the moon. On the same principle, sheep are shown when the moon is waxing, because it is supposed that the wool will then be longest and most enduring. Some Negroes of the Gaboon think that taro and other vegetables never thrive if they are planted after full moon, but that they grow fast and strong if they are planted in the first quarter. The Highlanders of Scotland used to expect better crops of grain by sowing their seed in the moon's increase. On the other hand, they thought that garden vegetables, such as onions and kale, run to seed if they are sown on the increase, but that they grow to pot herbs if they are sown in the wane. So Thomas Tusser advised the peasant to sow seeds and beans in the wane of the moon, that they with the planet may rest and arise. The Zulus welcomed the first appearance of the new moon with beatings of drums and other demonstrations of joy. But next day they abstained from all labour, thinking that if anything is sown on those days, they can never reap the benefit thereof. But in this matter of sowing and planting, a refined distinction is sometimes drawn by French, German, and Estonian peasants. Plants which bear fruit above ground are sown by them when the moon is waxing, but plants which are cultivated for the sake of their roots, such as potatoes and turnips, are sown when the moon is waning. The reason for this distinction seems to be a vague idea that the waxing moon is coming up and the waning moon going down, and that accordingly fruits which grow upwards should be sown in the former period, and fruits which grow downwards in the latter. Before beginning to plant their cacao, the Pipiles of Central America exposed the finest seeds for 4 nights to the moonlight. But whether they did so at the waxing or waning of the moon is not said. Even pots, it would seem, are not exempt from this great law of nature. In Uganda, potters waited for the new moon to appear before baking their pots. When it was some days old, they prepared their fires and baked the vessels. No potter would bake pots when the moon was past the full, for he believed that they would be a failure and would be sure to crack or break in the burning. If he did so, and that his labour accordingly would go for nothing. The phases of the moon in relation to the felling of timber. Again, the waning of the moon has been commonly recommended both in ancient and modern times as a proper time for felling trees, apparently because it was thought fit and natural that the operation of cutting down should be performed on earth at the time when the lunar orb was, so to say, being cut down in the sky. In France before the Revolution, the forestry laws enjoined that trees should only be felled after the moon had passed the full, and in French bills announcing the sale of timber, you may still read a notice that the wood was cut in the waning of the moon. So among the Shans of Burma, when a house is to be built, it is a rule that a lucky day should be chosen to commence the cutting of the bamboos. The day must not only be a fortunate one for the builder, but it must also be in the second half of the month, when the moon is waning. Shans believe that if bamboos are cut during the first half of the month, when the moon is waxing, they do not last well, as boring insects attack them and they will soon become rotten. The belief is prevalent all over the East. A like belief obtains in various parts of Mexico. No Mexican will cut timber while the moon is increasing. They say it must be cut while the moon is waning or the wood will certainly rot. In Colombia, South America, people think that corn should only be sown and timber felled when the moon is on the wane. They say that the waxing moon draws the sap up through the trunk and branches, whereas the sap flows down and leaves the wood dry during the wane of the moon. But sometimes the opposite rule is adopted, and equally forcible arguments are urged in its defense. Thus, when the Wambonde of Eastern Africa are about to build a house, they take care to cut the posts bore it when the moon is on the increase, for they say that posts cut when the moon is wasting away would soon rot, whereas posts cut while the moon is waxing are very durable. The same rule is observed for the same reason in some parts of Germany. The moon regarded as the source of moisture. But the partisans of the ordinarily received opinion have sometimes supported by another reason, which introduces us to the second of those fallacious appearances by which men have been led to regard the moon as a cause of growth in plants. From observing rightly that dew falls most thickly on cloudless nights, they inferred wrongly that it was caused by the moon, a theory which the poet Alcman expressed in a mythical form by saying that dew was a daughter of Zeus and the moon. Hence the ancients concluded that the moon is the great source of moisture, as the sun is the great source of heat. And as the humid power of the moon was assumed to be greater when the planet was waxing than when it was waning, they thought that timber cut during the increase of the luminary would be saturated with moisture, whereas timber cut in the wane would be comparatively dry. Hence we are told that in antiquity, carpenters would reject timber felled when the moon was growing or full because they believed that such timber teemed with sap. And in the Vosges, at the present day, people allege that wood cut at the new moon does not dry. We have seen that the same reason is assigned for the same practice in Colombia. In the Hebrides, peasants give the same reason for cutting their peats when the moon is on the wane, for they observe that if they are cut in the increase, they continue still moist and never burn clear, nor are they without smoke, but the contrary is daily observed of peats cut in the decrease. The moon being viewed as the cause of vegetable growth is naturally worshipped by agricultural peoples. Thus, misled by a double fallacy, primitive philosophy comes to view the moon as a great cause of vegetable growth. First, because the planet seems itself to grow, and second, because it is supposed to be the source of dew and moisture. It is no wonder, therefore, that agricultural people should adore the planet which they believe to influence so profoundly the crops on which they depend for subsistence. Accordingly, we find that in the hotter regions of America, where maize is cultivated and manioc is the staple food, the moon was recognized as the principal object of worship, and plantations of manioc were assigned to it as a return for the service it rendered in the production of the crops. The worship of the moon in preference to the sun was general among the Caribs, and perhaps also among most of the other Indian tribes who cultivated maize in the tropical forests to the east of the Andes, and the same thing has been observed under the same physical conditions among the Aborigines of the hottest regions of Peru, the northern valleys of Yancapara. Here the Indians of Pacasmayo and the neighboring valleys revered the moon as their principal divinity. The house of the moon at Pacasmayo was the chief temple of the district, and the same sacrifices of maize flour, of wine, and of children which were offered by the mountaineers of the Andes to the sun god, were offered by the lowlanders to the moon god, in order that he might cause their crops to thrive. In ancient Babylonia, where the population was essentially agricultural, the moon god took precedence of the sun god and was indeed reckoned his father. Thus Osiris, the old corn god, was afterwards identified with the moon. Hence it would be no matter for surprise if, after worshipping the crops which furnished them with the means of subsistence, the ancient Egyptians should in later times have identified the spirit of the corn with the moon, which a false philosophy had taught them to regard as the ultimate cause of the growth of vegetation. In this way we can understand why, in their most recent forms, the myth and ritual of Osiris, the old god of trees and corn, should bear many traces of efforts made to bring them into a superficial conformity with the new doctrine of his lunar affinity. End of Section 9. Section 10 of The Golden Bough, A Study in Magic and Religion. Part 4, Adonis, Attis, Osiris, Volume 2, by Sir James George Frazer. Chapter 9, The Doctrine of Lunar Sympathy. The Doctrine of Lunar Sympathy. In the preceding chapter, some evidence was adduced of the sympathetic influence which the waxing or waning moon is popularly supposed to exert on growth, especially on the growth of vegetation. But the doctrine of lunar sympathy does not stop there. It is applied also to the affairs of man, and various customs and rules have been deduced from it, which aim at the amelioration and even the indefinite extension of human life. To illustrate this application of the popular theory at length would be out of place here, but a few cases may be mentioned by way of specimen. Theory that all things wax or wane with the moon. The natural fact on which all the customs in question seem to rest is the apparent monthly increase and decrease of the moon. From this observation, men have inferred that all things simultaneously wax or wane in sympathy with it. Thus the mantras or mantras of the Malay Peninsula have tradition that in the beginning men did not die but grew thin with the waning of the moon, and waxed fat as she neared the full. Of the Scottish Highlanders, we are told that the moon in her increase, full growth, and in her wane are with them the emblems of a rising, flourishing, and declining fortune. At the last period of her revolution, they carefully avoid to engage in any business of importance, but the first and middle they seize with avidity, presaging the most auspicious issue to their undertakings. Similarly, in some parts of Germany, it is commonly believed that whatever is undertaken when the moon is on the increase succeeds well, and that the full moon brings everything to perfection, whereas business undertaken in the wane of the moon is doomed to failure. This German belief has come down, as we might have anticipated, from barbaric times, for Tacitus tells us that the Germans considered the new or the full moon the most auspicious time for business, and Caesar informs us that the Germans despaired of victory if they joined battle before the new moon. The Spartans seem to have been of the same opinion, for it was a rule with them never to march out to war except when the moon was full. The rule prevented them from sending troops in time to fight the Persians at Marathon, and but for Athenian valor, this paltry superstition might have turned the scale of battle and decided the destiny of Greece, if not of Europe, for centuries. The Athenians themselves paid dear for a similar scruple. An eclipse of the moon cost them the loss of a gallant fleet and army before Syracuse, and practically sealed the fate of Athens, for she never recovered from the blow. So heavy is the sacrifice which superstition demands of its votaries. In this respect, the Greeks were on a level with the Negroes of the Sudan, among whom, if a march has been decided upon during the last quarter of the moon, the departure is always deferred until the first day of the new moon. No chief would dare to undertake an expedition and lead out his warriors before the appearance of the crescent. Merchants and private persons observe the same rule on their journeys. In like manner, the Mandingos of Senegambia pay great attention to the changes of the moon, and think it very unlucky to begin a journey or any other work of consequence in the last quarter. The ceremonies observed at new moon are often magical rather than religious, being intended to renew sympathetically the life of man. It is especially the appearance of the new moon, with its promise of growth and increase, which is greeted with ceremonies intended to renew and invigorate by means of sympathetic magic the life of man. Observers, ignorant of savage superstition, have commonly misinterpreted such customs as worship or adoration paid to the moon. In point of fact, the ceremonies of new moon are probably in many cases rather magical than religious. The Indians of the Ucayali River in Peru hail the appearance of the new moon with great joy. They make long speeches to her, accompanied with vehement gesticulations, imploring her protection and begging that she will be so good as to invigorate their bodies. On the day when the new moon first appeared, it was a custom with the Indians of San Juan Capistrano in California to call together all the young men for the purpose of its celebration. "Corre la luna," shouted one of the old men. "Come, my boys, the moon, the moon." Immediately the young men began to run about in a disorderly fashion, as if they were distracted, while the old men danced in a circle, saying, "As the moon dieth and cometh to life again, so we also, having to die, will again live." An old traveller tells us that at the appearance of every new moon, the Negroes of the Congo clapped their hands and cried out, sometimes falling on their knees, "So may I renew my life as thou art renewed." But if the sky happened to be clouded, they did nothing, alleging that the planet had lost its virtue. A somewhat similar custom prevails among the Ovambo of southwestern Africa. On the first moonlight night of the new moon, young and old, their bodies smeared with white earth, perhaps in imitation of the planet's silvery light, dance to the moon and address to it wishes which they feel sure to be granted. We may conjecture that among these wishes is a prayer for a renewal of life. When a Maasai sees a new moon, he throws a twig or stone at it with his left hand and says, "Give me long life," or "Give me strength." And when a pregnant woman sees a new moon, she milks some milk into a small gourd, which she covers with green grass. Then she pours the milk away in the direction of the moon and says, "Moon, give me my child safely." Among the Wagogo of German East Africa, at sight of the new moon, some people break a stick in pieces, spit on the pieces, and throw them towards the moon, saying, "Let all illness go to the west, where the sun sets." Among the Boloki of the Upper Congo, there is much shouting and gesticulation on the appearance of a new moon. Those who have enjoyed good health pray that it may be continued, and those who have been sick ascribe their illness to the coming of the luminary, and beg her to take away bad health and give them good health instead. The Estonians think that all the misfortunes which might befall a man in the course of a month may be forestalled and shifted to the moon, if a man will only say to the new moon, "Good morrow, new moon. I must grow young, you must grow old. My eyes must grow bright, yours must grow dark. I must grow light as a bird, you must grow heavy as iron." On the 15th day of the moon, that is, at the time when the luminary has begun to wane, the Koreans take round pieces of paper, either red or white, which represent the moon, and having fixed them perpendicularly on split sticks, they place them on the tops of the houses. The persons who have been forewarned by storytellers of impending evil pray to the moon to remove it from them. Attempts to eat or drink the moonlight. In India, people attempt to absorb the vital influence of the moon by drinking water in which the luminary is reflected. Thus the Mohammedans of Ura fill a silver basin with water and hold it so that the orb of the full moon is mirrored in it. The person to be benefited must look steadfastly at the moon in the basin, then shut his eyes and drink the water at one gulp. Doctors recommend the draught as a remedy for nervous disorders and palpitation of the heart. Somewhat similar customs prevail among the Hindus of northern India. At the full moon of the month of Kohar, September-October, people lay out food on the housetops, and when it has absorbed the rays of the moon, they distribute it among their relations, who are supposed to lengthen their life by eating of the food which has thus been saturated with moonshine. Patients are often made to look at the moon reflected in melted butter, oil, or milk as a cure for leprosy and the like diseases. The supposed influence of moonlight on children, presentation of infants to the new moon. Naturally enough, the genuine influence of moonshine is often supposed to be partially beneficial to children, for will not the waxing moon help them to wax in strength and stature? Hence in the island of Kirewina, one of the Trobriads group to the east of New Guinea, a mother always lifts up or presents her child to the first full moon after its birth in order that it may grow fast and talk soon. So among the Baganda of Central Africa, it was customary for each mother to take her child out at the first new moon after its birth and to point out the moon to the infant. This was thought to make the child grow healthy and strong. Among the Thonga of South Africa, the presentation of the baby to the moon does not take place until the mother has resumed her monthly periods, which usually happens in the 3rd month after the birth. When the new moon appears, the mother takes a torch or a burning brand from the fire and goes to the ash heap behind the hut. She is followed by the grandmother carrying the child. At the ash heap, the mother throws the burning stick towards the moon, while the grandmother tosses the baby into the air, saying, "This is your moon." The child squalls and rolls over on the ash heap. Then the mother snatches up the infant and nurses it, so they go home. Infants presented to the moon by the Guarianos Indians of Bolivia and the Apinacos Indians of Brazil. The Guarianos Indians, who inhabit the gloomy tropical forests of eastern Bolivia, lift up their children in the air at new moon in order that they may grow. Among the Apinacos Indians on the Tocantins River in Brazil, the French traveller Castelnau witnessed a remarkable dance by moonlight. The Indians danced in 2 long ranks which faced each other, the women on one side, the men on the other. Between the 2 ranks of dancers blazed a great fire. The men were painted in brilliant colours, and for the most part wore white or red skull caps made of maize flour and resin. Their dancing was very monotonous and consisted of a jerky movement of the body, while the dancer advanced first one leg and then the other. This dance they accompanied with a melancholy song, striking the ground with their weapons. Opposite them, the women, naked and unpainted, stood in a single rank, their bodies bent slightly forward, their knees pressed together, their arms swinging in measured time, now forward, now backward, so as to join hands. A remarkable figure in the dance was a personage painted scarlet all over, who held in his hand a rattle composed of a gourd full of pebbles. From time to time he leaped across the great fire which burned between the men and the women. Then he would run rapidly in front of the women, stopping now and then before one or other and performing a series of strange gambols while he shook his rattle violently. Sometimes he would sink with one knee to the ground and then suddenly throw himself backward. Altogether the agility and endurance which he displayed were remarkable. The dance lasted for hours. When a woman was tired out, she withdrew, and her place was taken by another. But the same men danced the monotonous dance all night. Towards midnight the moon attained the zenith and flooded the scene with her bright rays. A change now took place in the dance. A long line of men and women advanced to the fire between the ranks of the dancers. Each of them held one end of a hammock in which lay a newborn infant, whose squalls could be heard. These babes were now to be presented by their parents to the moon. On reaching the end of the line, each couple swung the hammock, accompanying the movement by a chant, which all the Indians sang in chorus. The song seemed to consist of 3 words, repeated over and over again. Soon a shrill voice was heard, and a hideous old hag, like a skeleton, appeared with her arms raised above her head. She went round and round the assembly several times, then disappeared in silence. While she was present, the scarlet dancer, with the rattle, bounded about more furiously than ever, stopping only for a moment while he passed in front of the lines of women. His body contracted and bent towards them, and described an undulatory movement like that of a worm writhing. He shook his rattle violently, as if he would fain kindle in the woman the fire which burned in himself. Then rising abruptly, he would resume his wild career. During this time, the loud voice of an orator was heard from the village repeating a curious name without cessation. Then the speaker approached slowly, carrying on his back some gorgeous bunches of brilliant feathers and under his arm a stone axe. Behind him walked a young woman bearing an infant in a loose girdle at her waist. The child was wrapped in a mat which protected it against the chill night air. The couple placed only for a minute or two and then vanished without speaking a word. At the same moment, the curious name which the orator had shouted was taken up by the whole assembly and repeated by them again and again. This scene in its turn lasted a long time, but ceased suddenly with the settling of the moon. The French traveller who witnessed it fell asleep, and when he awoke, all was calm once more. There was nothing to recall the infernal dances of the night. The presentation of infants to the moon is probably intended to make them grow. In explanation of these dances, Castanel merely observes that the Apinagos, like many other South American Indians, pay a superstitious respect to the moon. We may suppose that the ceremonious presentation of the infants to the moon was intended to ensure their life and growth. The names solemnly chanted by the whole assembly were probably those which the parents publicly bestowed on their children. As to the scarlet dancer who leaped across the fire, we may conjecture that he personated the moon, and that his strange antics in front of the women were designed to impart to them the fertilizing virtue of the luminary, and perhaps to facilitate their delivery. Baganda ceremonies at new moon. Among the Baganda of Central Africa, there is general rejoicing when the new moon appears, and no work is done for 7 days. When the crescent is first visible at evening, mothers take out their babies and hold them at arm's length, saying, "I want my child to keep in health till the moon wanes." At the same time, a ceremony is performed which may be intended to ensure the king's life and health throughout the ensuing month. It is a custom with the Baganda to preserve the king's navel string with great care during his life. The precious object is called the twin of the king, as if it were his double, and the ghost of the royal afterbirth is believed to be attached to it. Enclosed in a pot which is wrapped in bark cloths, the navel string is kept in a temple specially built for it near the king's enclosure, and a great minister of state acts as its guardian and priest. Every new moon, at evening, he carries it in state, wrapped in bark cloths, to the king, who takes it into his hands, examines it, and returns it to the minister. The keeper of the navel string then goes back with it to the house and sets it in the doorway, where it remains all night. Next morning it is taken from its wrappings and again placed in the doorway until the evening, when it is once more swathed in black cloths and restored to its usual place. Apparently the navel string is conceived as a vital portion, a sort of external soul of the king, and the attentions bestowed on it at the new moon may be supposed to refresh and invigorate it, thereby refreshing and invigorating the king's life. Baleful influence supposed to be exercised by the moon on children. The Armenians appear to think that the moon exercises a baleful influence on little children. To avert that influence, a mother will show the moon to her child and say, "Thine uncle, thine uncle." For the same purpose, the father and mother will mount to the roof of the house at new moon on a Wednesday or Friday. The father then puts the child on a shovel and gives it to the mother, saying, "If it is thine, take it to thee, but if it is mine, rear it and give it to me back." The mother then takes the child and the shovel and returns them to the father in like manner. A similar opinion as to the noxious influence of moonshine on children was apparently held by the ancient Greeks, for Greek nurses took great care never to show their infants to the moon. Some Brazilian Indians in like manner guarded babies against the moon, believing that it would make them ill. Immediately after delivery, mothers will hide themselves and their infants in the thickest parts of the forest in order that the moonlight may not fall on them. It would be easy to understand why the waning moon should be deemed injurious to children. They might be supposed to pique and pine with this dwindling light. Thus in Angus it is thought that if the child be weaned during the waning of the moon, it will decay all the time that the moon continues to wane. but is less easy to see why the same deleterious influence on children should be ascribed to moonlight in general. Use of the moon to increase money or decrease sickness. There are many other ways in which people have sought to turn lunar sympathy to practical account. Clearly, the increase of the moon is the time to increase your goods, and the decrease of the moon is the time to diminish your ills. Acting on this imaginary law of nature, many persons in Europe show their money to the new moon, or return it in their pockets at that season in the belief that the money will grow with the growth of the planet. Sometimes, by way of additional precaution, they spit on the coin at the same time. Both Christians and Muslims in Syria turn their silver money in their pockets at the new moon for luck, and two persons meeting under the new moon will each take out a silver coin and embrace, saying, "May you begin and end, and may it be a good month to us." Conversely, the waning of the moon is the most natural time to get rid of bodily ailments. In Brittany, they think that warts vary with the phase of the moon, growing as it waxes and vanishing away as it wanes. Accordingly, they say in Germany that if you would rid yourself of warts, you should treat them when the moon is on the decrease. And a German cure for toothache, earache, headache and so forth is to look towards the waning moon and say, "As the moon decreases, so may my pains decrease also." However, some Germans reverse the rule. They say, for example, that if you are afflicted with a wen, you should face the waxing moon, lay your finger on the wen and say thrice, "What I see waxes, what I touch let it vanish away." After each of these two sentences you should cross yourself thrice, then go home without speaking to anyone, and repeat 3 paternosters behind the kitchen door. The huzuls of the Carpathians recommend a somewhat similar and no doubt equally efficacious cure for waterbrush. They say that at new moon the patient should run thrice round the house and then say to the moon, "Moon, moon, where wast thou? Behind the mountain. What hast thou eaten there? Horseflesh. Why hast thou brought me nothing? Because I forgot. May the waterbrush forget to burn me." Thus a curative virtue appears to be attributed by some people to the waning and by others to the waxing moon. There is perhaps just as much or as little to be said for the one attribution as for the other. End of section 10. Section 11 of The Golden Bough, A Study in Magic and Religion, Part 4. Adonis, Attis, Osiris, Volume 2, by Sir James George Frazer. Chapter 10. The King as Osiris. Osiris personated by the King of Egypt. In the foregoing discussion, we found reason to believe that the Semitic Adonis and the Phrygian Attis were at one time personated in the flesh by kings, princes, or priests who played the part of the god for a time, then either died a violent death in the divine character or had to redeem their life in one way or another, whether by performing a make-believe sacrifice at some expense of pain and danger to themselves, or by delegating the duty to a substitute. Further, we conjectured that in Egypt the part of Osiris may have been played by the king himself. It remains to adduce some positive evidence of this personation. The said festival celebrated in Egypt at intervals of 30 years. A great festival called the Sed was celebrated by the Egyptians with much solemnity at intervals of 30 years. Various portions of the ritual are represented on the ancient monuments of Hierakonpolis and Abydos, and in the oldest decorated temple of Egypt known to us, that of Usir-Niri at Busiris, which dates from the 5th dynasty. It appears that the ceremonies were as old as the Egyptian civilization, and that they continued to be observed till the end of the Roman period. The reason for holding them at intervals of 30 years is uncertain, but we can hardly doubt that the period was determined by astronomical considerations. According to one view, it was based on the observation of Saturn's period of revolution around the Sun, which is, roughly speaking, 30 years, or more exactly, 29 years and 174 days. According to another view, the 30 years period had reference to Sirius, the star of Isis. We have seen that on account of the vague character of the old Egyptian year, the heliacal rising of Sirius shifted its place gradually through every month of the calendar. In 120 years, the star thus passed through one whole month of 30 days. To speak more precisely, it rose on the first of the month during the first 4 years of the period. It rose in the second of the month in the second 4 years, on the third of the month in the third 4 years, and so on successively, till in the last 4 years of the 120 years, it rose on the last day of the month. As the Egyptians watched the annual summer rising of the star with attention and associated it with the most popular of their goddesses, it would be natural that its passage from one month to another, at intervals of 120 years, should be on the occasion of a great festival, and that the long period of 120 years should be divided into 4 minor periods of 30 years respectively, each celebrated by a minor festival. If this theory of the said festivals is correct, we should expect to find that every 4th celebration was distinguished from the rest by a high degree of solemnity, since it marked the completion of a 12th part of the star's journey through the 12 months. Now it appears that in point of fact, every 4th said festival was marked off from its fellows by the adjective tep, or chief, and that these chief celebrations fell as a rule in the years when Sirius rose on the 4th of the month. These facts confirm the view that the said festival was closely connected with the star Sirius, and through it with Isis. Intention of the said festival to renew the king's life. However, we are here concerned rather with the meaning and the rites of the festival than with the reasons for holding it once every 30 years. The intention of the festival seems to have been to procure for the king a new lease of life, a renovation of his divine energies, a rejuvenescence. In the inscriptions of Abydos we read, after an account of the rites, the following address to the king: Thou dost recommence thy renewal, thou art granted to flourish again like the infant god moon. Thou dost grow young again, and that, from season to season, like none at the beginning of time, thou art born again in renewing the said festivals. All life comes to thy nostril, and thou art king of the whole earth forever. In short, on these occasions, it appears to have been supposed that the king was in a manner born again. The king identified with the dead Osiris at the said festival. But how was the new birth effected? Apparently the essence of the rites consisted in identifying the king with Osiris, for just as Osiris had died and risen again from the dead, so the king might be thought to die and to live again with the god whom he personated. The ceremony would thus be for the king a death as well as a rebirth. Accordingly, in pictures of the said festival on the monuments, we see the king posing as the dead Osiris. He sits in a shrine like a god, holding in his hands the crook and the flail of Osiris. He is wrapped in tight bandages like the mummified Osiris. Indeed, there is nothing but his name to prove that he is not Osiris himself. This enthronement of the king in the attitude of the dead god seems to have been the principal event of the festival. Further, the queen and the king's daughters figured prominently in the ceremonies. A discharge of arrows formed part of the rites, and in some sculptures at Karnak, the queen is portrayed shooting arrows towards the 4 quarters of the world, while the king does the same with rings. The oldest illustration of the festival is on the Mace of Narmer, which is believed to date from 5500 BC. Here we see the king seated as Osiris in a shrine at the top of 9 steps. Beside the shrine stand fan bearers, and in front of it is a figure in a palanquin, which according to an inscription in another representation of the scene, appears to be the royal child. An enclosure of curtains hung on poles surrounds the dancing ground, where 3 men are performing a sacred dance. A procession of standards is depicted beside the enclosure. It is headed by the standard of the jackal god Up-Uat, the opener of ways for the dead. Similarly, on the seal of King Zer, or rather Kent, one of the early kings of the First Dynasty, the monarch appears as Osiris with the standard of the jackal god before him. In front of him too is the ostrich feather on which the dead king was supposed to ascend into heaven. Here then the king identified Osiris, king of the dead, as before him the jackal god, who leads the dead, and the ostrich feather, which symbolizes his reception into the sky. There are even grounds for thinking that in order to complete the mimic death of the king at the said festival, an effigy of him, clad in the costume of Osiris, was solemnly buried in a cenotaph. Professor Flinders Petrier's explanation of the said festival. According to Professor Flinders Petrier, the conclusion may be drawn thus. In the savage age of prehistoric times, the Egyptians, like many other African and Indian peoples, killed their priest king at stated intervals, in order that the ruler should, with unimpaired life and health, be enabled to maintain the kingdom in its highest condition. The royal daughters were present in order that they might be married to his successor. The jackal god went before him to open the way to the unseen world, and the ostrich feather received and bore away the king's soul in the breeze that blew it out of sight. This was the celebration of the end, the said feast. The king thus became the dead king, patron of all those who had died in his reign, who were his subjects here and hereafter. He was thus one with Osiris, the king of the dead. This fierce custom became changed, as in other lands, by appointing a deputy king to die in his stead, which idea survived in the Coptic Abu Naruz, with his tall crown of Upper Egypt, false beard and scepter. After the death of the deputy, the real king renewed his life and reign. Henceforward this became the greatest of the royal festivals, the apotheosis of the king during his life, after which he became Osiris upon earth and the patron of the dead in the underworld. Alexandre Moret's theory that at the said festivals the king was supposed to die and to be born again. A similar theory of the said festival was maintained by another eminent Egyptologist, M. Alexandre Moret. He says, in most of the temples of Egypt, of all periods, pictures set forth for us the principal scenes of a solemn festival called Festival of the Tail, the said festival. It consisted essentially in a representation of the ritual death of the king followed by his rebirth. In this case the king is identified with Osiris, the god who in historical times is the hero of the sacred drama of humanity, he who guides us through the three stages of life, death and rebirth in the other world. Hence, clad in the funeral costume of Osiris with a tight-fitting garment clinging to him like a shroud, Pharaoh is conducted to the tomb, and from it he returns rejuvenated and reborn like Osiris emerging from the dead. How was this fiction carried out? How was this miracle performed? By the sacrifice of human or animal victims. On behalf of the king, a priest lay down in the skin of an animal victim. He assumed the posterior characteristic of an embryo in its mother's womb. When he came forth from the skin, he was deemed to be reborn. And Pharaoh, for whom this rite was celebrated, was himself reborn, or to adopt the Egyptian expression, he renewed his births. And in testimony of the due performance of the rites, the king grit his loins with the tail, a compendious representative of the skin of the sacrificed beast, whence the name of the Festival of the Tail. How are we to explain the rule that at a certain point of his reign, every pharaoh must undergo this ritual death followed by a fictitious rebirth? Is it simply a renewal of the initiation into the Assyrian mysteries, or does the festival present some more special features? The ill-defined part played by the royal children in these rites seems to me to indicate that the said festival represents other episodes which refer to the transmission of the regal office. At the dawn of civilization in Egypt, the people were perhaps familiar with the alternative, either of putting their king to death in his full vigour in order that his power should be transmitted intact to his successor, or of attempting to rejuvenate him and to renew his life. The latter measure was an invention of the pharaohs. How could it be carried out more effectively than by identifying themselves with Osiris, by applying to themselves the process of resurrection, the funeral rites by which Isis, according to the priests, had magically saved her husband from death? Perhaps the fictitious death of the king may be regarded as a mitigation of the primitive murder of the divine king, a transition from a barbarous reality to symbolism. Osiris personated by the king of Egypt. Whether this interpretation of the said festival be accepted in all its details or not, one thing seems quite certain. On these solemn occasions, the god Osiris was personated by the king of Egypt himself. That is the point with which we are here chiefly concerned. End of Section 11. Section 12 of The Golden Bough, a study of magic and religion. Part 4, Adonis, Attis, Osiris, Volume 2, by Sir James George Frazer. Chapter 11, The Origin of Osiris. Part 1. How did the conception of Osiris as a god of vegetation and the dead originate? Thus far we have discussed the character of Osiris as he is presented to us in the art and literature of Egypt and the testimonies of Greek writers, and we have found that, judged by these indications, he was in the main a god of vegetation and of the dead. But we have still to ask, how did the conception of such a composite deity originate? Did it arise simply through observation of the great annual fluctuations of the seasons and a desire to explain them? Was it a result of brooding over the mystery of external nature? Was it the attempt of a rude philosophy to lift the veil and explore the hidden springs that set the vast machine in motion? That man at a very early stage of his long history meditated on these things and evolved certain crude theories which partially satisfied his craving after knowledge is certain. From such meditations of Babylonian and Phrygian sages appear to have sprung the pathetic figures of Adonis and Attis, and from such meditations of Egyptian sages may have sprung the tragic figure of Osiris. While Adonis and Attis were subordinate figures in their respective pantheons, Osiris was the greatest and most popular god of Egypt. Yet a broad distinction seems to sever the myth and worship of Osiris from the kindred myths and worships of Adonis and Attis. For while Adonis and Attis were minor divinities in the religion of Western Asia, completely overshadowed by the greater deities of their respective pantheons, the solemn figure of Osiris towered in solitary grandeur over all the welter of Egyptian gods. Like a pyramid of his native land, lit up by the last rays of the setting sun when all below is in its shadow. And whereas legend generally represents Adonis and Attis as simple swains, mere herdsmen or hunters, who in the fatal love of a goddess had elevated above their homely sphere into a brief and melancholy preeminence, Osiris uniformly appears in tradition as a great and beneficent king. In life he ruled over his people, beloved and revered for the benefits he conferred on them and on the world. In death he reigned in their hearts and memories as Lord of the dead, awful judge at whose bar every man must one day stand to give an account of the deeds done in the body and to receive the final award. In the faith of the Egyptians, the cruel death and blessed resurrection of Osiris occupied the same place as the death and resurrection of Christ hold in the faith of Christians. As Osiris died and rose again from the dead, so they hoped through him, and in his dear name, to wake triumphant from the sleep of death to a blissful eternity. That was their sheet anchor in life's stormy sea. That was the hope which supported and consoled millions of Egyptian men and women in a period of time far longer than that during which Christianity has now existed on earth. In the long history of religion, no two divine figures resemble each other more closely in the fever of personal devotion which they have kindled and in the high hopes which they have inspired than Osiris and Christ. The sad figure of Buddha, indeed, has been as deeply loved and revered by countless millions, but he had no glad tidings of immortality for men, nothing but the promise of a final release from the burden of mortality. The personal devotion of the Egyptians to Osiris suggests that he may have been a real man, for all the permanent religious or semi-religious systems of the world have been founded by individual great men. And if Osiris and Christ have been the centres of the like enthusiastic devotion, may not the secret of their influence have been similar? If Christ lived the life and died the death of the man on earth, may not Osiris have done so likewise? The immense and enduring popularity of his worship speaks in favour of the supposition. For all the other great religious or semi-religious systems which have won for themselves a permanent place in the affections of mankind have been founded by individual great men, who by their personal life and example exerted a power of attraction such as no cold abstractions, no pale products of the collective wisdom or folly could ever exert on the minds and hearts of humanity. Thus it was with Buddhism, with Confucianism, with Christianity, and with Mohammedanism, and thus it may well have been with the religion of Osiris. Certainly we shall do less violence to the evidence if we accept the unanimous tradition of ancient Egypt on this point than if we resolve the figure of Osiris into a myth pure and simple. And when we consider that from the earliest to the latest times Egyptian kings were worshipped as gods both in life and in death, there appears to be nothing extravagant or improbable in the view that one of them, by his personal qualities, excited a larger measure of devotion than usual during his life, and was remembered with fonder affection and deeper reverence after his death, till in time his beloved memory, dimmed, transfigured, and encircled with a halo of glory by the mists of time, grew into the dominant religion of his people. At least this theory is reasonable enough to deserve a serious consideration. If we accept it, we may suppose that the mythical elements which legend undoubtedly ascribed to Osiris were later accretions which gathered about his memory like ivy about a ruin. There is no improbability in such a supposition. On the contrary, all analogy is in its favour, for nothing is more certain than that myths grow like weeds around the great historical figures of the past. The historical reality of Osiris as an old king of Egypt can be supported by modern African analogies. In recent years, the historical reality of Osiris as a king who once lived and reigned in Egypt has been maintained by more than one learned scholar, and without venturing to pronounce a decided opinion on so obscure and difficult a question, I think it worthwhile, following the example of Dr. Wallace Budge, to indicate certain modern African analogies which tend to confirm the view that beneath the mythical wrappings of Osiris there lay the mummy of a dead man. At all events, the analogies which I shall cite suffice to prove that the custom of worshipping dead kings has not been confined to Egypt, but has been apparently widespread throughout Africa, though the evidence now at our disposal only enables us to detect the observance of the custom at a few points of the great continent. But even if the resemblance in this respect between ancient Egypt and modern Africa should be regarded as established, it would not justify us in inferring an ethnical affinity between the fair or ruddy Egyptians and the black aboriginal races, who occupy almost the whole of Africa except a comparatively narrow fringe on the northern seaboard. Scholars are still divided on the question of the original home and racial relationship of the ancient Egyptians. It has been held on the one hand that they belong to an indigenous white race which has been always in possession of the Mediterranean coasts of Africa, and on the other hand it has been supposed that they are akin to the Semites in blood as well as in language, and that they entered Africa from the east, whether by gradual infiltration or a sudden wave of conquest like the Arabs in the decline of the Roman Empire. On either view, a great gulf divided them from the swarthy natives of the Sudan, with whom they were always in contact on their southern border, and though a certain admixture may have taken place through marriage between the two races, it seems unsafe to assume that the religious and political resemblances which can be traced between them are based on any close relationship than the general similarity in structure and functions of the human mind. The spirits of dead kings worshipped by the Shiluks of the White Nile. In a former part of this work, we saw that the Shiluks, a pastoral and partially agricultural people of the White Nile, worship the spirits of their dead kings. The graves of the deceased monarchs form indeed the national or tribal temples, and as each king is interred at the village where he is born and where his afterbirth is buried, these grave shrines are scattered over the country. Each of them usually comprises a small group of round huts, resembling the common houses of the people, the whole being enclosed by a fence. One of the huts is built over the grave, the others are occupied by the guardians of the shrine, who at first are generally the widows or old men servants of the deceased king. When these women or retainers die, they are succeeded in office by their descendants. for the tombs are maintained in perpetuity so that the number of temples and of gods is always on the increase. Sacrifices to the dead kings. Cattle are dedicated to these royal shrines and animals sacrificed at them. For example, when the millet crop threatens to fail or a murian breaks out among the beasts, one of the dead kings will appear to somebody in a dream and demand a sacrifice. The dream is reported to the king, and he immediately orders a bullock and a cow to be sent to the grave of the dead king who appeared in a vision of the night to the sleeper. This is done. The bullock is killed and the cow added to the sacred herd of the shrine. It is customary also, though not necessary, at harvest to offer some of the new millet at the temple tombs of the kings, and sick people send animals to be sacrificed there on their behalf. Special regard is paid to trees that grow near the graves of the kings, and the spirits of the departed monarchs are believed to appear from time to time in the form of certain animals. One of them, for example, always takes the shape of a certain insect, which seems to be the larvae of the mantidae. When a shilluk finds one of these insects, he would take it up in his hands and deposit it reverentially at the shrine. Other kings manifest themselves as a certain species of white birds. Others assume the form of giraffes. When one of these long-legged and long-necked creatures comes stalking up fearlessly to a village where there is a king's grave, the people know that the king's soul is in the animal, and the attendants at the royal tomb testify their joy at the appearance of their master by sacrificing a sheep or even a bullock. Worship of Nyakang, the first of the Shilluk kings. But of all the dead kings, none is revered so deeply or occupies so large a place in the minds of the people as Nyakang, the traditional founder of the dynasty and the ancestor of all the kings who have reigned after him to the present day. Of these kings, the Shilluks have preserved the memory and the genealogy, 26 said to have sat on the throne since Nyakang, but the period of time covered by their reigns is much shorter than it would have been under conditions such as now prevail in Europe. For down to the time when their country came under British rule, it was a regular system of the Shilluks to put their kings to death as soon as they showed serious symptoms of bodily or mental decay. The custom was based on the conviction that the king must not be allowed to become ill or senile, lest with his diminishing vigour the cattle should sicken and fail to bear their increase. The crops should rot in the fields, and a man stricken with disease should die in ever-increasing numbers. It is said that Nyakang, like Romulus, disappeared in a great storm, which scattered all the people about him. In their absence, the king took a cloth, tied it tightly round his neck, and strangled himself. According to one account, that is the death which all his ancestors on the throne have died. But while tradition appears to be unanimous as to the custom of regicide, it varies as to the precise mode in which the kings were relieved of their office and of life. But still the people are convinced that Nyakang did not really die, but only vanished mysteriously away like the wind. When a missionary asked the Shilluks as to the manner of Nyakang's death, they were filled with amazement at his ignorance and stoutly maintained that he never died. For were he to die, all the Shilluks would die also. The graves of this deified king are shown in various parts of the country. The spirit of Nyakang is supposed to manifest itself in certain animals. From time to time, the spirit of Nyakang manifests itself to his people in the form of an animal. Any creature of regal port or surpassing beauty may serve as his temporary incarnation. Such among wild animals are lions, crocodiles, little yellow snakes that crawl about men's houses, the finest sorts of antelopes, flamingos with their rose pink and scarlet plumage, and butterflies of all sorts with their brilliant and varied hues. An unusually fine head of cattle is also recognized as the abode of the great king's soul. For example, he once appeared in the shape of a white bull, whereupon the living king commanded special sacrifices to be offered in honor of his deified predecessor. When a bird in which the royal spirit is known to be lodged lights on a tree, that tree becomes sacred to Nyakang. Beads and cloth are hung on its boughs, sacrifices and prayers are offered below it. Once when the Turks unknowingly felled such a tree, Fear and horror fell on the Shillaks who beheld the sacrilege. They filled the air with lamentations and killed an ox to appease their insulted ancestor. Particular regard is also paid to trees that grow near the graves of Nayakang, though they are not regularly worshipped. In one place, 2 gigantic baobab trees are pointed out as marking the spot where Nayakang once stood. The sacrifices are now offered under their spreading shade. The deified Nayakang seems to have been a real man. There seems to be no doubt that in spite of the mythical elements which have gathered round his memory, Nayakang was a real man who led the Shillaks to their present home on the Nile, either from the west or from the south, for on this point tradition varies. The first and most important ancestor who was everywhere revered is Nayakang, the first Shillak king. He always receives the honourable titles of Father, Uwo, Ancestor, Kwa, King, Red, or King's Roar. Ancestors, the great man above, Kal Duong Mal, to distinguish him from the other great men on earth. Nayakang, as we know, was an historical personage. He led the Shillaks to the land which they now occupy. He helped them to victory, made them great and warlike, regulated marriage and law, distributed the country among them, divided into districts, in order to increase the dependence of their people on him, and to show them his power, became their greatest benefactor by giving himself out as the bestower of rain. Relation of Nayakang to the creator Juok. Yet Nayakang is now universally revered by the people as a demigod. Indeed, for all practical purposes, his worship quite eclipses that of the supreme god Juok, the creator, who, having ordered the world, committed it to the care of ancestral spirits and demons, and now dwelling aloft, concerns himself no further with human affairs. Hence men pay little heed to their creator and seldom take his name into their lips, except in a few conventional forms of salutation at meeting and parting, like our goodbye. Far otherwise it is with Nayakang. He is the ancestor of the Shillak nation and the founder of the Shillak dynasty. He is worshipped, sacrifices and prayers are offered to him. He may be said to be lifted to the rank of a demigod, though they never forget that he has been a real man. He is expressly designated as little in comparison with God. Yet in the political, religious and personal life, Nayakang takes a far more important place than Juok. Nayakang is the national hero of whom each Shillak feels proud, who is praised in innumerable popular songs and saying, he is not only a superior being, but also a man. He is a sublime model for every true Shillak. Everything they value most in their national and private life has its origin in him. Their kingdom and their fighting, as well as cattle breeding and farming. While Nayakang is their good father, who only does them good, Juok is a great uncontrollable power, which is to be propagated in order to avoid his inflictions of evil. Indeed, the whole working religion of the Shillak is a cult of Nayakang, a semi-divine ancestor of their kings, in each of whom his spirit is immanent. The transmission of the divine or semi-divine spirit of Nayakang to the reigning monarch appears to take place at the king's installation, and to be effected by means of a rude wooden effigy of Nayakang, in which the spirit of the deified man is perhaps supposed to be immanent. But however the spiritual transmission may be carried out, the fundamental idea of the cult of the Shillak divine kings is the immanence in each of the spirit of Nayakang. Thus the Shillak kings are encircled with a certain halo of divinity because they are thought to be animated by the divine spirit of their ancestor, the founder of the dynasty. The belief in the former humanity of Nayakang is confirmed by the analogy of his worship to that of the dead Shillak kings. The universal belief of the Shillaks in the former humanity of Nayakang is strongly confirmed by the exact parallelism which prevails between his worship and that of the dead kings, his successor. Like them, he is worshipped at his tomb, but unlike them, he has not one tomb only, but 10 scattered over the country. Each of these tombs is called the grave of Nayakang, though the people well know that nobody is buried there. Like the grave shrines of the other kings, those of Nayakang consist of a small group of circular huts of the ordinary pattern enclosed by a fence. Only children under puberty and the few old people whose duty is to take care of the shrines may enter these sacred enclosures. The rites performed at them resemble those observed at the shrines of the kings. 2 great ceremonies are annually performed at the shrines of Nyakang. One is observed before the beginning of the rainy season in order to ensure a due supply of rain. The other is a thanksgiving at harvest, when porridge made from the new grain is poured out on the threshold of Nyakang's hut and smeared on the outer walls of the building. Even before the millet is reaped, and people cut something of the ripening ears and thrust them into the thatch of the sacred hut. Thus it would seem that the Shillaks believe themselves to be dependent on the favour of Nyakang for the rain and the crops. As a giver of rain, Nyakang is the first and greatest benefactor of the people. In that country, rain is everything. Without rain there is nothing. The Shillak does not trouble his head about artificial irrigation, he waits for the rain. If the rain falls, then the millet grows, the cows thrive, man has food and can dance and marry, for that is the ideal of the Shillaks. Sick people also bring or send sheep as an offering to the nearest shrine of Nyakang in order that they may be healed of their sickness. The attendants of the sanctuary slaughter the animal, consume its flesh, and give the sufferer the benefit of their prayers. Comparison of Nyakang with Osiris. The example of Nyakang seems to show that under favourable circumstances, the worship of a dead king may develop into the dominant religion of a people. There is, therefore, no intrinsic improbability in the view that in ancient Egypt the religion of Osiris originated in that way. Certainly some curious resemblances can be traced between the dead Nyakang and the dead Osiris. Both died violent and mysterious deaths. The graves of both were pointed out in many parts of the country. Both were deemed the great sources of fertility for the whole land, and both were associated with certain sacred trees and animals, particularly with bulls. And just as Egyptian kings identified themselves, both in life and death, with their deified predecessor, Osiris, so Shilluk kings are still believed to be animated by the spirit of their deified predecessor, Nyakang, and to share his divinity. The spirits of dead kings worshipped by the Baganda of Central Africa. Another African people who regularly worship, or rather used to worship, the spirits of their dead kings are the Baganda. Their country, Uganda, lies at the very source of the Nile, where the great river issues from Lake Victoria, Nyanza. Among them, the ghosts of dead kings were placed on an equality with the gods and received the same honour and worship. They foretold events which concerned the state, and they advised the living king, warning him when war was likely to break out. The king consulted them periodically, visiting first one and then another of the temples in which the mortal remains of his predecessors were preserved with religious care. But the temple, Malolo, of the king contained only his lower jawbone and his navel string, Molongo. His body was buried elsewhere, for curiously enough, the Baganda believed that the part of the body to which the ghost of a dead man adheres above all others is the lower jawbone. Wherever that portion of his person may be carried, the ghost, in the opinion of these people, will follow it, even to the ends of the earth, and will be perfectly content to remain with it so long as the jawbone is honoured. Hence the jawbones of all the kings of Uganda, from the earliest times to the present day, have been preserved with the utmost care, each of them being deposited, along with the stump of the monarch's navel string, in a temple specially dedicated to the worship of the king's ghost. For it is believed that the ghosts of the deceased monarchs would quarrel if they shared the same temple, the question of precedence being one which it would be very difficult for them to adjust to their mutual satisfaction. All the temples of the dead kings stand in the district called Busiro, which means a place of the graves, because the tombs as well as the temples of the departed potentates are situated within its boundaries. The supervision of the temples and of the estates attached to them was a duty incumbent on the Mugema, or Earl of Busiro, one of the few hereditary chiefs of the country. His principal office was that of Prime Minister, Katikiro, to the dead kings. Tombs of the dead kings of Uganda. When a king dies, his body is sent to Busiro and there embalmed. Then it is laid to rest in a large roundhouse which has been built for its reception on the top of a hill. This is the king's tomb. It is a conical structure supported by a central post, with a thatched roof reaching down to the ground. Round the hut a high strong fence of reeds is erected, and an outer fence encircles the whole at some distance lower down the hill. Here the body is placed on a bedstead. The sepulchral chamber is filled with dark cloths till it can hold no more. The main post is cut down and the door of the tomb closed, so that no one can enter it again. When that was done, the wives of that king used to be brought and their arms pinioned and placed at intervals round the outer wall of the tomb, where they were clubbed to death. Hundreds of men were also killed in the space between the two fences, that their ghosts might wait on the ghost of the dead king in the other world. None of their bodies were buried, they were left to rot where they fell. Then the gates in the fences were closed, and 3 chiefs with their men guarded the dead bodies from the wild beasts and the vultures. But the hut in which the king's body reposed was never repaired. It was allowed to moulder and fall into decay. Ghosts of the dead kings of Uganda are supposed to adhere to their lower jawbones and their navel strings, which are accordingly preserved in temples dedicated to the worship of the kings. 5 months later, the jawbone of the royal corpse was removed in order to be fashioned into an effigy or representative of the dead king. For this purpose, 3 chiefs entered the tomb, not through the door, but by cutting a hole through the wall, and having severed their head from the body, they bored it out, carefully filling up the hole in the wall behind them, replacing the thatch and securing the gates in the fence. When the jawbone had been removed by a chief of the civet clan, the skull was sent back to Busiro and buried with honour near the mouldering tomb. In contrast to the neglect of the tomb where the royal body lay, the place where the skull was buried was kept in good repair and guarded by some of the old princesses and widows. Just as the jawbone, it was put in an anthill and left there till the ants had eaten away all the flesh. Then after it had been washed in beer and milk, it was decorated with cowrie shells and placed in a wooden vessel. This vessel was next wrapped in bark cloths till it assumed a conical shape, about 2.5 feet high by 1.5 foot broad at the base. This conical packet, decorated on the outside with beads, was treated as an image of the deceased king, or rather as if it were the king himself in life, for it was called simply the king. Beside it was placed the stump of the king's navel string, similarly wrapped in bark cloths and decorated, though not made up into a conical shape. The reason for preserving both the jawbone and the navel string was that the ghost of the king was supposed to attach itself to his jawbone, and the ghost of his double to his navel string. For in the belief of the Baganda, every person has a double, namely the afterbirth or placenta, which is born immediately after him, as regarded by the people as a second child. Now that double has a ghost of his own, which adheres to the navel string, and if the person is to remain healthy, it is essential that the ghost of his double should be carefully preserved. Hence, every Baganda man and woman keeps his or her navel string wrapped up in a bark cloth as a treasure of great price, on which his health and prosperity are dependent. The precious little bundle is called his twin, Bolongo, because it contains the ghost of his double, the afterbirth. If that is deemed necessary for everybody, much more is it deemed essential for the welfare of the king. Hence, during his life, the stump of his navel string is kept, as we saw, by one of the principal ministers of state, and is inspected by the king himself every month. And when his majesty has departed this life, the unity of his spirit imperatively demands that his own ghost and the ghost of his double should be kept together in the same place. That is why the jawbone and the navel string of every dead king are carefully preserved in the same temple, because the 2 ghosts adhere respectively to these 2 parts of his person, and it would be unreasonable and indeed cruel to divide them. The Temples of the Dead Kings of Uganda. The 2 ghosts having been thus safely lodged in the 2 precious puzzles, the next thing was to install them in the temple, where they were to enter on their career of beneficent activity. A site having been chosen, the whole country supplied the labour necessary for building the temple. The ministers were appointed to wait upon the dead king. The officers of state who had held important posts during his life retained their titles and continued to discharge their duties towards their old masters in death. Accordingly, houses were built for them near the temple. The Dowager Queen also took up her residence at the entrance to the temple enclosure and became its principal guardian. Many also of the king's widows of lower rank were drafted off to live inside the enclosure and keep watch over it. When the queen or any of these widows died, her place was supplied by another princess or a woman of the same clan, for the temple was maintained in perpetuity. However, when the reigning king died, the temple of his predecessor lost much of its importance, though it was still kept up in a less magnificent style. Indeed, no temple of a dead king was allowed to disappear altogether. Of all the attendants at the temple, the most important probably was a prophet or medium, Manthwa, whose business it was from time to time to be inspired by the ghost of the deceased monarch and to give oracles in his name. To this holy office he dedicated himself by drinking a draught of beer and a draught of milk out of the dead king's skull. Oracles given by the dead kings of Uganda by the mouth of an inspired prophet. The temple consecrated to the worship of a king regularly stood on a hill. The site was generally chosen by the king in his life, but sometimes his choice was set aside by a successor who gave orders to build the temple in another place. The structure was a large conical or beehive-shaped hut of the ordinary pattern, divided internally into two chambers, an outer and an inner. Any person might enter the outer chamber, but the inner was sacred and no profane person might set foot in it, for there the holy relics of the dead king, his jawbone and his navel string were kept with safety in a cell dug in the floor, and there, in close attendance on them, the king's ghost was believed to dwell. In front of the partition which screened this holy of holies from the gaze of the multitude, there stood a throne, covered with lion and leopard skins, and fenced off from the rest of the sacred edifice by a glittering rail of brass spears, shields, and knives. A forest of poles, supporting the roof, formed a series of aisles in perfect line, and at the end of the central nave appeared, like the altar of a Christian church, the throne in all its glory. When the king's ghost held a reception, the holy relics, the jawbone and the navel string, each in its decorated wrappings, were brought forth and set on the throne, and every person who entered the temple bowed to the ground and greeted the jawbone with an awe-struck voice, for he regarded it as their king in person. Solemn music played during the reception, the drums rolling and the women chanting, while they clapped their hands to the rhythm of the songs. Sometimes the dead king spoke to the congregation by the voice of his prophet. This was a great event. When the oracle was about to be given to the expectant throng, the people stepped up to the throne and, addressing the spirit, informed him of the business in hand. Then he smoked one or two pipes, and the fumes bringing on the prophetic fit, he began to rave and to speak in the very voice and with the characteristic tones of speech of the departed monarch, for the king's spirit was now in him. This message from the world beyond the grave was naturally received with rapt attention. Gradually, the fit of inspiration passed. The voice of the prophet resumed its natural tones. The spirit had departed from him and returned to its abode in the inner room. Such a solemn audience used to be announced beforehand by the beating of the drums in the early morning, and the worshippers brought with them to the temple offerings of food for the dead king, as if he were still alive. Visit paid by the living king to the temple of his dead father. But the greatest day of all was when the reigning king visited the temple of his father. This he did as a rule only once during his reign. Nor did the people approve of the visits being repeated, for each visit was a signal for the death of many. Yet attracted by a painful curiosity, crowds assembled, followed the monarch to the temple, and thronged to see the great ceremony of the meeting between the king and the ghost of his royal father. The sacred relics were displayed. An old man explained them to the monarch and placed them in his hands. The prophet, inspired by the dead king's spirit, revealed to the living king his destiny. The interview over, the king was carried back to his house. It was on the return journey that he always gave, suddenly and without warning, the signal of death. Human victims sacrificed in order that their ghosts might serve the ghost of the dead king. Obedient to his orders, the guards rushed upon the crowd, captured hundreds of spectators, pinioned them, marched them back to the temple, and stored them within the precincts, that their ghosts might wait on the ghost of the dead king. But though the king rarely visited his father's ghost to the temple, he had a private chapel for the ghost within the vast enclosure of the royal residence, and here he often paid his devotion to the august spirit, of whom he stood greatly in awe. He took his wives with him to sing the departed monarch's praise, and he constantly made offerings at the shrine. Thither too would come the prophet to suck words of wisdom from the venerable ghost and to impart them to the king, who thus walked in the counsel of his glorified father. The souls of the dead kings worshipped in Kiziba. In Kiziba, a district of Central Africa on the western side of Lake Victoria, Nyanza, the souls of dead kings become ruling spirits. Temples are built in their honor and priests appointed to serve them. The people are composed of two different races, the Bough, who are Aboriginals, and the Bahima, who are immigrants from the north. The royal family belongs to the Bahima stock. In his lifetime, the king's person is sacred, and all his actions, property, and so forth are described by special terms appropriated to that purpose. The people are divided into totemic clans. The totems, or zero, are mostly animals or parts of animals. No man may kill or eat his totem animal, nor marry a woman who has the same totem as himself. The royal family seems to have serpents for their totem. After death, the king's soul lives in a serpent, while his body is buried in the hut where he died. The people revere a supreme god named Rugaba, who is believed to have created man and cattle, but they know little about him, and though they occasionally pray to him, particularly in the case of a difficult birth, he has no priests and receives no sacrifices. The business of the priests is to act as intermediaries, not between God and man, but between men and the spirits. The spirits are believed to have been formerly kings of the world. The highest of them is a certain Wamara, who rules over the souls of the dead, and would seem to have been a great king in his life. Temples are built for him. They are like the houses of men, but only half as large. A perpetual holy fire is kept up in each temple, and the priest passes the night in it. He receives white sheep or goats as victims, and generally acts also as a diviner or physician. When a man is very ill, he thinks that Wamara, the lord of the spirits of the dead, is summoning him to the far country, so he sends a sacrifice to Wamara's priest, who prays to the spirit to let the sick man live yet a while. This great spirit of an ancient king, who now rules over the dead, resembles the Egyptian Osiris. The worship of ancestral spirits among the Bantu tribes of northern Rhodesia. The Bantu tribes who inhabit the great tableland of northern Rhodesia revere a supreme being whom they call Leza, but their ideas about him are hazy. Thunder, lightning, earthquakes, rain, and other natural phenomena are grouped together under his name as manifestations of his power. Among the more progressive tribes, such as the Awemba and the Webiza, the great god is thought to take some interest in human affairs, and though they do not pray to him, they nevertheless invoke him by his names of praise, which set forth his attributes as a protector and judge of mankind. It is he too who receives the souls of the departed. Yet as far as the dominant Wemba tribe is concerned, the cult of Leza is outside their ordinary religion. There is no direct access to him by prayer or by sacrifices, which are made to Bulenka and the other great tribal and ancestral spirits instead. For upon such animism is found the whole fabric of Wemba religion. The ancestral spirits whom the Awemba and all other tribes of this region worship may be divided into two main classes. First come the spirits of departed chiefs, who are publicly worshipped by the whole tribe, and second come the spirits of near relations, who are worshipped privately by each head of a family. Among the Awemba, there is no special shrine for these purely family spirits, who are worshipped inside the hut, and to whom the family's sacrifice of a sheep, a goat, or a fowl is made, the spirit receiving the blood spilt on the ground, while all the members of the family partake of the flesh together. For a religious Wemba man, the cult of the spirit of his nearest relations, of his grandparents, or of his deceased father, mother, elder brother, or maternal uncle, is considered quite sufficient. Out of these spirit relatives, a man will worship one whom he considers as his special familiar for various reasons. For instance, the diviner may have told him that his last illness was caused because he had not respected the spirit of his uncle. Accordingly, he will be careful in future to adopt his uncle as his tutelary spirit. As a mark of such respect, he may devote a cow or a goat to one of the spirits of his ancestors. Holding the fowl, for instance, in his hands, he would dedicate it, asking the spirit to come and abide in it, upon which the fowl is let go and is afterwards called by the name of the spirit. If the necessities, however, of the larder demand that it should be killed and other animals taken, and the spirit is asked to accept it as a substitute. Before beginning any special task, such as hoeing a new garden or going on a journey, Wamba men invoke their tutelary spirit to be with them and to assist their efforts. In short, ejaculatory prayers usually couched in a set formula. Among many of the tribes in North Longwa district, longer formal prayers are still made to all the deceased ancestors of the clan at the time of harvest, asking them to protect the crops and to drive away illnesses and evil spirits from the family, which honors them with libations of beer and offerings of the first fruits. The worship of ancestral spirits is apparently the main practical religion of all the Bantu tribes. Thus, among these tribes, who all belong to the great Bantu family, the public worship which a whole tribe pays to the souls of its dead chiefs is probably nothing but an extension of the private worship which every family pays privately to the souls of its dead members. And just as the members of his family, whom a man worships privately, are not mythical beings conjured up by imagination out of a distant past, but were once real men like himself, whom he knew in life, it may be his father, or uncle, or elder brother, so we may be sure that in like manner the dead chiefs revered by the whole tribe are not creations of the mythical fancy, but were once real men of flesh and blood, who ruled over the tribe, and whose memory has been more or less faithfully preserved by tradition. In this respect, the tribes in northern Rhodesia are typical of all the tribes of that great Bantu family which occupies nearly the whole southern half of Africa, from the great equatorial lakes to the Cape of Good Hope. The main practical religion of all these numerous and widespread peoples appears to be the worship of their ancestors. The worship of ancestral spirits among the Bantu tribes of South Africa. To adduce in full the evidence which points to this conclusion would lead us too far from our present subject. It must suffice to cite a few typical statements of competent authorities which refer to different tribes of the Bantu stock. Speaking with special reference to the tribes of southeastern Africa, the Reverend James MacDonald tells us that the religion of the Bantu, which they not only profess but really regulate their conduct by, is based on the belief that the spirits of their ancestrals interfere constantly in their affairs. Every man worships his own ancestors and offers sacrifices to avert their wrath. The clan worships the spirits of the ancestors of its chiefs, and the tribe worships the spirits of the ancestors of the paramount chief. The religion of the Bantu is based upon the supposition of the existence of spirits that could interfere with the affairs of this world. These spirits were those of their ancestors and their deceased chiefs, the greatest of whom had control over lightning. When the spirits became offended or hungry, they sent a plague or disaster until sacrifices were offered and their wrath or hunger was appeased. The head of a family of commoners on such an occasion killed an animal and all ate of the meat, as the hungry ghost was supposed to be satisfied with the smell. For example, in the year 1891, the son of a chief of the Pondomisi tribe was arrested for an assault and sent to trial before a colonial court. It chanced to be a season of intense heat and severe drought, and the Pondomisi tribe attributed these calamities to the wrath of a dead chief named Gwanya, very famous in his lifetime, whose body, fastened to a log, had been buried under a heap of stones in the deep pool of the Lina River. This redoubtable chieftain was a seventh ancestor in the direct line of the man who had committed the assault, and he warmly resented the indignity which the whites had done to a noble scion of his house by consigning him to durance vile. To appease the natural indignation of the ghost, the tribesmen killed cattle on the banks of the pool which contained his grave, and threw the flesh into the water along with the new dishes full of beer. The prisoner, however, was convicted of the assault and sentenced by the ruthless magistrate, who was no respecter of ghosts, to pay a fine. But the tribe clubbed together and paid the fine for him, and a few days later rain fell in plenty. The mollified ghost had opened the celestial sluices. Sacrifices to the dead among the Bantu tribes of South Africa. Another writer, describing the religion of the South African Bantus, tells us that the ancestral spirits love the very things they loved before they passed through the flesh. They cherish the same desires and have the same antipathies. The living cannot add to the number of the wives of ancestral spirits, but they can kill cattle in their honor and keep their praise and memory alive on earth. Above all things, they can give them beef and beer, and if the living do not give them sufficient of these things, the spirits are supposed to give the people a bad time. They send drought, the sickness and famine, until people kill cattle in their honor. When men are alive, they love to be praised and flattered, fed and attended to. After death, they want the very same things, for death does not change personality. In time of drought, or sickness, or great trouble, there would be great searchings of heart as to which ancestor had been neglected, for the trouble would be supposed to be caused by the neglected ancestor. Most of the people would get the subject on their nerves, at least as far as a Kaffir could get anything on the leather strings which do duty for nerves, and someone would be sure to have a vivid dream in which an ancestor would complain that the people had not praised him half enough of late. So an ox would be killed, either by the head man of the kraal or by a diviner. Then the man would say over the ox as it was being killed, "Cry out, ox of so-and-so, listen to us, so-and-so, this is your ox. We praise you by all your Lord-giving names, and tell of all your deeds. Do not be angry with us any more. Do you not see that this is your ox? Do not accuse us of neglecting you, when forsooth we have ceased to praise you and offer you meat and beer. Take note then, that here is another ox we are offering to you. When the ox is dead, some of the meat is fixed with herbs and medicines and placed in a hut with a bowl full of blood. The meat is placed in the part of the hut where the man loved to sit while he was alive, and someone is told off to guard the sacrifice. The meat is left for a night or longer, and the spirits are supposed to come and enjoy the smell or drink the serum which oozes from the meat, and to inhale the smell of the beer. The priest or diviner will then sprinkle the people and the huts with medicine made from the contents of the stomach of the ox. He places a little on his shirt. When this is dry, he burns it and calls on the spirits to smell the incense. After the meat has been left for a certain time, it is taken out and cooked and eaten by the men near the cattle kraal in public. If the trouble does not vanish after this ceremony, the people get angry and say to the spirits, "When have we ceased to kill cattle for you? And when have we ever refused to praise you by your praise names? Why then do you treat us so shabbily? If you do not behave better, we shall utterly forget your names, and then what will you do when there is no one to praise you? You will have to go and live on grasshoppers. If you do not mend your ways, we shall forget you. What use is it that we kill oxen for you and praise you? You do not give us rain or crops, or cause our cattle to bear well. You show no gratitude in return for all we do for you. We shall utterly disown you. We shall tell the people that, as for us, we have no ancestral spirits, and this would be to your shame. We disgust with you. Thus, the sweet savour of beef and beer does not suffice the content Kaffir ghosts. They share the love of praise and flattery with many gods of higher rank." End of section 12.